Picture this. You walk into a party expecting some olives, maybe a little bread, and suddenly everyone's half-dressed, chanting to the gods and pouring wine like it's the last night on earth. Welcome to ancient Greece, where even the word wild night feels like an understatement. Buckle up, because what you're about to hear makes your last awkward family gathering look like a tea party with grandma. The first thing to understand about the ancient Greeks is that for them, sex was not just a private matter hidden behind closed doors, whispered about in hushed tones. It was everywhere. It was in their temples, in their theaters, in their myths, and in the very fabric of their daily life. To them, the body was not a cage for the soul. It was a vessel of divine energy, a tool through which gods and humans could connect. To talk about religion in Greece without talking about sexuality is like trying to describe wine without mentioning grapes. Their spirituality was soaked in the pleasures of the flesh, and their gods were not shy about it either. Zeus couldn't keep his robes tied, Aphrodite couldn't stop making mortals fall in love, and Dionysus practically invented the phrase, "party until you drop." But what makes this both fascinating and disturbing is the way they normalized sexual ritual as a pathway to the sacred. Imagine walking into a temple expecting solemn chants and incense, and instead finding a ritual where worshippers drank themselves senseless, stripped off their clothes, and danced under the moon until bodies collapsed together in a frenzy. For the Greeks, that wasn't sacrilege, that was worship. Pleasure wasn't separate from piety, it was proof of it. They believed that by letting go of control, by surrendering to passion, they were tapping into a divine current. Try telling that to a modern congregation and watch how fast the ushers escort you out. The link between sex and the divine ran deeper than just festivals. Consider their mythology. The very origin of the gods is tied to erotic imagery. The castration of Uranus gave birth to Aphrodite rising from the sea foam. Fertility, desire, creation, these weren't embarrassing footnotes, they were central chapters. If the universe itself was born from acts of passion and violence, why should mortals behave differently? To them, participating in sexual rites wasn't just indulgence. It was a way of syncing their bodies with cosmic truths. It is almost comedic how seriously they took this. Imagine explaining to your spouse that joining an orgy was not infidelity, but an act of devotion. Somehow, in ancient Greece, that excuse might actually have worked. Still, there was an undeniable social function at play. These rituals were equalizers, moments when aristocrats and peasants, men and women, citizens and foreigners, could blur the boundaries that normally divided them. In the heat of a Dionysian celebration, a slave could dance beside his master, and for a few hours they were both simply bodies caught in ecstasy. Sex, in this sense, was not only spiritual but political. It was rebellion and release, a way of turning society upside down, at least until sunrise, when the hierarchies clicked back into place. If you think about it, that's not too different from how some people treat modern music festivals, a temporary escape where everyone pretends the world outside doesn't exist. The Greeks also believed that denying the body's urges was a kind of insult to the gods. After all, why would the divine give you desire if you weren't meant to use it? There's an uncomfortable wisdom in that idea. Today we often talk about discipline and restraint as higher virtues, but the Greeks would have laughed at that. To them, resisting pleasure wasn't strength, it was foolishness. They celebrated excess as a way of honoring the divine spark within themselves. This is where the comedy of history sets in. We live in a world obsessed with self-control and diets, while the Greeks got drunk on sacred wine and called it religion. Somewhere, Dionysus is probably laughing at us, but underneath the revelry was something darker. The idea that sex could bind you to the gods, but also to power structures. Priests and priestesses often controlled access to these rituals. Sacred prostitution wasn't just tolerated, it was institutionalized, with women and men serving as living offerings to the gods. Their bodies became currency, devotion measured in sweat and skin. To participate was to blur the line between worship and exploitation. It raises uncomfortable questions. Were these people liberated, or were they trapped in a system that dressed up desire as duty? The answer is both, and that tension is what makes their world so gripping to study. Consider also the role of spectacle. These rites weren't done in secret back rooms. They were performed in ways that ensured everyone saw and remembered. Processions marched through the streets carrying giant phallic symbols. Crowds cheered, songs filled with innuendo echoed off stone walls. It was theater, ritual, and chaos rolled into one. The Greeks understood something we sometimes forget. Humans are drawn to shock, to scandal, to the sight of boundaries being crossed. They knew that to hold a society together, you sometimes needed to let it come undone, at least for a night. And perhaps that is the most haunting insight of all. For the Greeks, sex wasn't a sin to be hidden. It was a sacred fire to be tended. They lived with an honesty about desire that feels both liberating and unsettling to modern sensibilities. It makes you wonder how much of our discomfort comes from centuries of cultural conditioning, and how much is simply fear of admitting that pleasure can be holy. The ancient Greeks didn't just admit it, they built temples to it, sang hymns to it, and wove it into the stories they told about who they were. The legacy of this openness still lingers, like a whisper through history. Every time we laugh at a dirty joke, every time a festival turns into something more than music, every time a society debates where the line between freedom and morality lies, we are echoing the same arguments the Greeks lived out in their rituals. Their world forces us to confront a question we rarely ask out loud. If desire is part of being human, why do we fear it so much? And perhaps, more unsettlingly, what happens when a culture not only accepts desire but crowns it as divine? To understand the ancient Greeks, you have to imagine a society where a religious festival could look more like a wild street party than a solemn prayer gathering. The Dionysian festivals, dedicated to the god of wine, ecstasy, and frenzy, were the perfect example. People didn't just sip their drinks politely, they consumed wine like it was liquid divinity, letting it blur their inhibitions until the line between worship and indulgence disappeared completely. In those moments, chaos was not only permitted but celebrated. It was the closest thing to divine possession, a god entering the body through intoxication and laughter. The Greeks truly believed that if you didn't loosen your grip on reason once in a while, you weren't fully alive. Ironically, they'd probably look at our carefully planned wine tastings today and laugh, wondering how we managed to turn sacred ecstasy into Instagram content. The atmosphere was contagious. Music pounded through flutes and drums, feet stomped the earth, and dancers spun in circles until they collapsed in ecstatic exhaustion. Imagine a village where every social rank suddenly dissolved. Merchants, farmers, aristocrats, even slaves moving together in the same rhythm. Hierarchies melted away, and for a brief time, everyone was swallowed by the same intoxicated current. The very idea that the strict Greek society, with its rules, citizenship rights, and moral codes, would allow this chaos seems contradictory, but that was the genius of it. The festivals didn't weaken society, they recharged it. Like a pressure valve releasing steam, these orgiastic celebrations prevented the tensions of everyday life from tearing the city apart. It's not so different from the way people today wait for holidays or carnivals to finally let go. The rituals themselves often included processions that were anything but modest. Priests carried enormous wooden phalluses through the streets, symbols of fertility and life force, while crowds sang songs filled with bawdy humor. It was comedy, religion, and sexuality rolled into one. You might call it scandalous, but to the Greeks, it was sacred theater. They weren't ashamed of these symbols, they were proud of them. After all, fertility wasn't just about human desire, it was about survival. Without fertility, there were no harvests, no animals, no future. So yes, they paraded oversized phalluses and laughed as they did it, turning what might make us blush into an act of cosmic seriousness. There's something refreshing about that honesty, even if it feels absurdly funny at first glance. The god at the heart of it, Dionysus, represented more than drunken revelry. He was the embodiment of paradox, both gentle and violent, liberating and destructive, joy-bringer and madness-maker. To honor him, worshippers allowed themselves to slip into a state where control was lost. Women known as maenads ran into forests at night, their hair loose, their voices wild, tearing animals apart in frenzied devotion. Men dressed in women's clothing, blurring gender roles as if mocking the rigid lines society drew between masculine and feminine. These acts weren't seen as shameful. They were gateways to a deeper truth. To lose yourself, even violently, was to touch the divine. It's unsettling, but also oddly familiar. Don't we still crave moments where we can escape ourselves, even if just for a night? And within this chaos, sexuality was everywhere. Intercourse was not merely tolerated, but expected, seen as part of the cosmic cycle of life, death, and rebirth. To engage in sex during a Dionysian rite was not considered scandalous. It was alignment with nature itself. Young initiates might find themselves drawn into these rituals as part of their entry into adulthood, their first taste of freedom wrapped in wine and mystery. It wasn't about romance, nor even about individual pleasure. It was about dissolving into the collective, losing yourself in the crowd until personal boundaries evaporated. There's a strange mix of awe and comedy in the thought. An entire community, half drunk, half naked, and wholly convinced that this chaos was the closest one could get to heaven. But there's another layer that complicates it. These festivals weren't only spiritual, they were political. Leaders tolerated and sometimes encouraged such excess because it reinforced their own control. By allowing the people to indulge in divine madness once in a while, they ensured loyalty the rest of the year. It was a calculated gamble. Give the citizens a taste of ecstasy, and they'll accept order the next morning. In a way, the entire system was a dance between repression and release. The Greeks understood what many governments since have forgotten. Sometimes letting people break the rules is the best way to keep them following them later. Stories of these rites shocked even other Greeks. Some philosophers warned that the Dionysian frenzy could turn society upside down, unleashing violence and immorality. Others defended it as necessary, a reminder that humans are not machines of reason but creatures of passion. The tension between those two views is still alive today. We like to believe we're rational, disciplined, and in control, But how often do we secretly crave the opposite? Isn't that why people chase after concerts, parties, and wild nights? Because for a moment they allow us to stop pretending? The legacy of these orgiastic festivals is not just in dusty history books. Their echoes live on in the way humans still use gatherings, music, intoxication, and sexuality to break down barriers and feel free. What feels shocking in the context of ancient temples feels oddly familiar in the neon lights of modern nightlife. And maybe that's why the Dionysian spirit still fascinates us. It asks a question that makes us uncomfortable. Are we truly alive if we never lose control? Or do we need chaos, laughter, and even scandal to remind ourselves of our humanity? When you picture ancient Greek religion, you might imagine statues of marble gods, solemn prayers, or sacrifices at the altar. But beneath that public surface existed another layer, one that was deliberately hidden, whispered about, and shrouded in secrecy. These were the initiation rites, ceremonies where young men and women were drawn into the mysteries of fertility and life through experiences that were as much physical as they were spiritual. To an outsider, they might have looked like scandalous parties or unspeakable taboos, but to those inside, they were gateways into adulthood and belonging. It was never simply about desire, it was about transformation. The Greeks believed that before someone could become a full participant in society, they needed to pass through the fire of the body, shedding innocence through ritualized sexuality. These initiations often happened in settings that enhanced their mystery: caves, groves, or temple chambers lit by torches and filled with the sound of chanting. The secrecy was deliberate. What happened inside was not meant for everyone to know. It created a bond of silence, the kind of silence that deepened loyalty. For the young initiates, often barely at the threshold of adulthood, the rituals were overwhelming. Imagine standing in a room heavy with incense, surrounded by masked figures, watching dances that blurred the line between a sacred movement and erotic display. At some point, wine would loosen inhibitions, and the participants would be drawn into acts meant to mirror the union of gods and goddesses, the merging of opposites, the eternal cycle of life and rebirth. If that sounds like something between a spiritual awakening and a very awkward first date, that's because it was both. The symbolism behind these rites was thick. Sexual union was not just pleasure, it was the reenactment of cosmic creation. Every embrace was a miniature version of the union between earth and sky. Every gasp, a reminder of the fertility that kept crops growing and families thriving. For the Greeks, nothing was more sacred than fertility, because fertility was survival. Without it, there was no food, no continuity, no hope. So the bodies of young initiates became living metaphors, their first experiences of desire transformed into sacred drama. It's strange to us, perhaps even shocking, to imagine parents allowing or even encouraging their children to enter such ceremonies, but in their eyes, it was no different than teaching someone how to work the fields or fight in war. It was part of preparing them for life. The gender roles in these rituals were telling. Young men might be paired with older mentors, reflecting the Greek acceptance of homoerotic bonds as a means of education and intimacy. Young women were often linked to priestesses or symbolic roles that connected them to the goddesses of fertility. The acts themselves could be both tender and brutal, depending on the cult. Some emphasized harmony and balance, others the raw frenzy of losing oneself entirely. Either way, the lesson was clear. To be human was to surrender at times to forces larger than yourself. And if those forces were expressed through the body, so be it. Even philosophers who criticized excess admitted that initiation stripped away fear and made individuals feel part of something eternal. The secrecy of these practices gave them power. It also gave rise to scandal and rumor. Outsiders whispered that orgies and debauchery ruled the night, and sometimes they weren't entirely wrong. But the real essence was not chaos. It was transformation. Participants emerged from these experiences changed, convinced they had glimpsed the divine through the mirror of flesh. In their silence afterward, they carried the weight of knowledge that bound them to their community more deeply than laws or politics ever could. It's oddly similar to how modern societies create rites of passage, though ours might be far tamer. Graduations, first jobs, the awkward teenage party where someone inevitably regrets karaoke. The Greeks simply turned the volume all the way up and said, if you're going to grow, you might as well grow through ecstasy. And yet, there's comedy hidden in the seriousness. Picture a trembling teenager, nervous about entering a ritual, only to find themselves in a swirl of masks, music, and nudity. Their fear must have been matched only by confusion and perhaps even laughter. The Greeks knew that embarrassment, like desire, was universal, and that sharing it built bonds stronger than speeches. It was both absurd and profound, a reminder that our deepest taboos often sit right beside our greatest truths. These initiation rituals were more than isolated ceremonies. They connected to the broader Greek belief that life was cyclical, that nothing ended but only transformed. Just as the seed fell into the soil to rise again as a plant, so too did the human body pass through stages of innocence, desire, maturity, and ultimately decline. To participate in these rites was to step consciously into that cycle, to say, I am part of this eternal pattern. Whether through tenderness or frenzy, through laughter or shame, the lesson endured. And if we strip away the shock, we're left with something timeless. The idea that to know yourself, you must pass through the vulnerability of the body. And if you dare to imagine the echoes of those nights, the firelight, the chants, the nervous anticipation, you realize that the Greeks were not so alien after all. They simply embraced openly what most societies prefer to hide. Temples in ancient Greece were not simply stone sanctuaries where incense drifted upward and hymns echoed through marble halls. For some, they were places where the sacred and the carnal merged so tightly that worship itself became inseparable from physical intimacy. The idea of sacred prostitution, men and women offering their bodies as living vessels of devotion, may sound scandalous to our modern ears, but to the Greeks, it was an act of alignment with divine will. To them, sex wasn't a profane distraction from holiness. It was one of its purest expressions. It's almost comical, really. Imagine telling someone today that dropping by the temple meant not kneeling to pray, but paying a priestess to commune with Aphrodite. Suddenly, the idea of long church services looks much more bearable. The most famous of these practices was tied to the worship of Aphrodite, goddess of love, beauty, and irresistible desire. In Corinth, her temple was said to house hundreds of priestesses, whose duties were not to recite prayers, but to physically embody the goddess's power. Visitors from across the Mediterranean came not only to marvel at the city's wealth, but to partake in its sanctified pleasures. It wasn't framed as vice, it was an offering. A man lying with a priestess wasn't seen as sinning. He was entering into union with Aphrodite herself. And the payment he gave was not a transaction, but a donation to the goddess. And what sounds like brothel economics to us was, in their eyes, theology in action. But beneath the surface of this divine framing lay a social complexity that reveals both brilliance and hypocrisy. On one hand, these temples elevated sexuality to something sacred, stripping it of shame and embedding it in the heart of religious practice. On the other hand, it gave priestly authorities enormous control, turning the bodies of women and young men into instruments of both devotion and revenue. Was it liberation, or was it exploitation wrapped in perfume and ritual? The answer, as so often in history, was both. For some, it was empowering, offering a role of prestige and influence. For others, it was a gilded cage where duty disguised itself as desire. The rituals themselves carried layers of symbolism. The sexual act was more than flesh meeting flesh. It was the cosmos reenacting its own creation. The seed planted was a metaphor for the harvest, the embrace a mirror of divine unions told in myth. Every sigh, every gasp, every trembling body was interpreted as a prayer acted out with skin instead of words. This made the experience more than pleasure. It was theater, it was myth, it was devotion. And yet, you can't help but imagine the awkwardness that must have sometimes crept in. Did every participant feel swept up in cosmic ecstasy? Or did some leave thinking, well, that was spiritual, I guess? Even in antiquity, not every performance was worthy of applause. Foreigners were especially fascinated by these temples. Sailors and traders, arriving in bustling ports, told tales of the sacred courtesans who were as essential to Corinth's fame as its architecture. The stories spread across seas, fueling both envy and scandal. Some marveled at the city's daring openness, while others muttered about corruption disguised as piety. And yet, the pilgrims kept coming. Just as tourists today flock to the world's more risque attractions while pretending to be shocked, so too did men of antiquity whisper criticism with one breath and praise with the next. The temple became not only a center of worship, but a global curiosity, a place where spirituality and carnality danced together under the marble gaze of Aphrodite. What makes these practices fascinating is how they reveal a society unashamed of mixing desire with devotion. The Greeks didn't hide their gods in purity and distance. They brought them into the flesh, into sweat, into laughter, into moans carried by torchlight. It challenges our modern reflex to separate the sacred from the sensual, as if the body and the soul could be neatly divorced. The Greeks knew better, or at least they believed they did. And maybe that's why their myths still captivate us. Because behind the stories of divine lovers and sanctified embraces lies a truth we still wrestle with, that the line between worship and pleasure has always been thinner than we like to admit. By the time the night ended and the temple lamps flickered low, participants walked away with more than the memory of intimacy. They carried the belief that they had touched divinity itself, that through the most human of acts they had brushed against eternity. And perhaps that is the most disarming realization. What we often reduce to scandal was, for them, the holiest prayer they knew how to make. And in that contradiction between what shocks us and what moved them lies the eternal tension of human desire trying to reach the divine. There was always a peculiar gravity to the role of women in the sacred spaces of Greece, a tension between reverence and exploitation. Young women, often barely at the edge of adulthood, were introduced into temple life not with hymns or solemn oaths, but with rituals that blurred the lines between duty, desire, and divinity. They were not simply priestesses in the sense we imagine today. Their bodies themselves were framed as altars, their intimacy as offerings to gods and men alike. To be chosen was, in theory, an honor, a mark that one was touched by the goddess, yet beneath the grandeur lurked the reality of a system that turned flesh into currency, weaving power and piety together in ways both brilliant and cruel. These young women were often presented as brides of the gods. In certain temples, especially those dedicated to Aphrodite or fertility deities, their service was believed to ensure the prosperity of the community. A successful harvest, a healthy birth, or even military victory might be attributed not to strategy or sweat, but to the sacred union carried out in perfumed chambers by women acting as divine surrogates. For the men who came to them, the act was not merely indulgence, but communion, an intimacy with the goddess herself, wrapped in silk and incense. Payment was not called a fee, but an offering, and the more extravagant the gift, the greater the supposed favor from the divine. It was a clever disguise, devotion dressed as desire, theology spun into economics. But imagine the pressure that placed on those women. Their youth and beauty were celebrated, yes, but in the same breath, they were confined, their choices bound to rituals scripted long before they were born. A girl might grow up hearing whispers that one day she could serve in the temple, that her body would become a bridge between men and gods. Some may have embraced the role with pride, seeing themselves as vessels of sacred power. Others, surely, must have felt the weight of a destiny they never asked for. It's a reminder that history often praises systems as noble without pausing to ask what the participants actually felt. We like to romanticize, but behind every veil and garland was a real person, with nerves, doubts, and a beating heart. The rituals themselves were layered with symbolism. A woman's embrace became a metaphor for the earth receiving seed, her sighs echoing the soil's fertility. Each act was retold in mythic language, draped in allegory, so that even the most intimate moments were lifted into cosmic importance. It's almost comical when you think about it. Imagine someone describing your personal life as an agricultural metaphor. Oh, that kiss you shared wasn't romance. It was a reenactment of Demeter blessing the crops. The Greeks mastered the art of making sex not only permissible but essential, cloaking it in a grandeur that both dignified and distorted its reality. What fascinates is how society viewed these women. They were both revered and stigmatized, admired as embodiments of the goddess, yet whispered about as women who had crossed the line of conventional modesty. They occupied a liminal space, neither fully honored nor entirely shamed, powerful yet powerless. In banquets and festivals, their presence was magnetic, their association with the temple lending them a mystique that few could rival. And yet, when their youth faded, many were quietly set aside, their sacred role replaced by younger faces. It raises an uncomfortable question. Was their holiness tied to the divine, or was it simply tied to beauty? The Greeks would have said both, but that answer only exposes the fragility of the system. Foreign visitors often marveled at these customs, carrying stories back to their homelands with a mix of awe and scandal. To some, the idea that sex could be sacred was liberating, even shocking in its honesty. To others, it was proof of Greek decadence, a society too entangled in desire to maintain purity. But that duality was exactly what made it powerful. The rituals provoked, unsettled, fascinated, because they forced people to confront the uncomfortable truth that desire and divinity are not opposites, but reflections of the same yearning. And isn't that what makes us still lean forward when we hear these stories? Because somewhere we recognize ourselves in them. By night, when the temple lamps flickered and the last of the worshippers stumbled away, those young women remained, draped in the lingering perfume of ritual. Some may have felt exalted, others used, most perhaps caught in the gray space between. But whatever their inner lives, the role they played shaped not only their fate, but the fate of the community. Crops, marriages, even politics rested on their bodies, a burden no less heavy for being wrapped in silk and myth. And that, perhaps, is the haunting legacy. The realization that power and vulnerability often sleep side by side, and that the line between honor and exploitation is thinner than rose petals scattered on temple floors. In the swirl of Greek ritual life, the roles of men and women were never symmetrical, but they were deliberately designed to complement one another in a way that mirrored both society and mythology. Men often entered these sacred ceremonies through structured roles that reflected power, order, and authority, while women embodied fertility, mystery, and the raw, untamed force of life. When both came together, sometimes literally, sometimes symbolically, the result was not simply a physical union, but a carefully staged reenactment of cosmic balance. It was less about two individuals and more about their bodies becoming metaphors for the eternal dance between male and female, sky and earth, seed and soil. At banquets that transitioned into rituals, the presence of heteras, those elite courtesans, was crucial. Unlike common prostitutes, these women were highly educated, skilled in conversation, music, and philosophy. They weren't just bodies for pleasure, they were companions, often more influential than the wives of the very men they entertained. In ritual settings, they blurred the line between earthly intimacy and divine inspiration. Their beauty wasn't only flesh deep, it was a carefully cultivated aura of power that made even generals and philosophers hang on their every word. If you think about it, they were the influencers of their day. Except instead of posting on Instagram, they were reciting Sappho and playing the lyre while reclining on silk cushions. Men, on the other hand, often carried roles tied to spectacle and dominance. Priests and male initiates were responsible for leading processions, chanting hymns, and ensuring that the rituals followed the proper structure. Yet, within the Dionysian festivals, those rigid roles often broke down. Men might dress as women, shedding their authority for a night of frenzy, abandoning control to experience what it meant to be overtaken by the god of madness. It was theater, but it was also liberation, an acknowledgement that even the most powerful needed release. It's almost comical to imagine a stern Athenian politician by day, donning a flowing dress at night, dancing until he collapsed, then returning to the assembly in the morning to debate taxes as if nothing had happened. The contrast itself was part of the ritual's magic. The encounters between men and women in these settings were staged as echoes of myth. Every embrace recalled Zeus descending upon a mortal lover, every kiss a nod to Aphrodite's eternal reign over passion. In some rites, the man represented the divine seed, while the woman embodied the earth waiting to be fertilized. Their intimacy was cloaked in metaphors of harvest and creation, turning sex into a sacred reenactment of agriculture itself. It sounds lofty, but also a little absurd. Imagine trying to enjoy yourself while a priest mutters about crop yields in the background. Still, the Greeks believed that reenacting these cosmic dramas ensured fertility not only of the body, but of the land itself. And yet, power dynamics simmered beneath the surface. While women could embody goddesses, their roles were often limited to fertility and desire, leaving the intellectual or administrative aspects of ritual to men. Men wrote the hymns, men directed the ceremonies, men told the myths that women were then expected to embody. It reveals the paradox of Greek spirituality. They exalted women as symbols of life itself, but rarely allowed them to steer the narrative. That contradiction is one we still wrestle with today, celebrating feminine energy while restricting female agency. The Greeks just dressed it up in garlands and called it sacred. What's remarkable is how comfortable the Greeks were with blurring lines of sexuality in these roles. A man could seek wisdom in the arms of a hetera, political support through temple alliances, and spiritual renewal through intimacy framed as devotion. Likewise, women serving in sacred roles often wielded more influence than wives bound to the domestic sphere. These intersections created a space where desire was currency, power was negotiated through touch, and influence could be built on a glance across a torchlit room. It was both liberating and limiting, empowering and exploitative. And that complexity is why the topic still grips us. By dawn, when the wine had thinned and the music faded, men and women would return to their ordinary roles: husbands, wives, fathers, daughters. But for a few hours, in the flicker of ritual, they had been gods and goddesses, soil and sky, instruments of divine drama. The memory of those roles lingered long after, shaping reputations, alliances, and even destinies. And perhaps that is what made the rituals so enduring. They offered participants the chance to step outside themselves to become myth for a night before returning to the daily grind. It was a reminder that beneath the rules of society, humans are always seeking spaces where passion and power collide, where roles can be reversed, and where, for once, everyone is allowed to feel infinite. The moment wine touched their lips, something shifted. It wasn't just the warmth of alcohol working its way through the bloodstream. It was the sense that they were part of something larger, something charged with divine permission. To drink was not to escape reality, but to step into a sacred delirium, a place where logic melted and passion took the throne. The Greeks believed wine carried the very essence of Dionysus, and when it coursed through the body, it wasn't simply drunkenness, it was possession. Every sway of the hips, every laugh too loud, every whisper that became a shout was explained not as loss of control, but as proof the god himself had entered you. Try using that excuse today at a party and see how fast your friends roll their eyes. But in the flickering firelight of Greek nights, intoxication had purpose. The more the senses blurred, the more participants felt freed from the rigid cages of daily life. Respectable citizens could abandon their masks of dignity, women could cast aside the restraints of modesty, and even slaves could dance with the reckless abandon of the free. This breaking down of barriers mattered because it created a shared ecstasy, a collective energy that felt like touching the divine. Imagine hundreds of voices chanting, bodies pressing together, laughter tumbling over drum beats. It was less a celebration than a storm, and everyone was swept into its eye. The body was no longer personal. It belonged to the ritual, to the group, to the god. The symbolism of intoxication extended far beyond the act of drinking. To the Greeks, drunkenness mirrored fertility. Just as soil needed water to soften before it could receive seed, so too did humans need to loosen before they could surrender to desire. Wine wasn't just a drink. It was a metaphor for readiness, a sacrament that transformed tension into release. That's why nearly every fertility rite involved it. A sober man could resist, analyze, hold back. But once his senses blurred, he became pliable, open, part of the flow. And if that sounds dangerously close to manipulation, it's because it was. The Greeks were masters of wrapping raw truths in divine language. They turned intoxication into theology, ensuring no one left the ritual without swallowing both the wine and the ideology. And then came the dancing. Frenzied, repetitive, exhausting, it pushed participants into a trance-like state where exhaustion tipped into ecstasy. Women, hair unbound, spun until their braids came loose, their bodies collapsing into the dirt only to rise again in wild devotion. Men stomped and shouted until their throats burned, their movements shaking off the stiffness of reason. It was theater, but it was also transformation. The chaos of the body mirrored the chaos of nature, the storm, the earthquake, the fire that destroys but also renews. To dance was to become part of that cycle, to embody the violence and fertility of the world itself. And if you've ever danced badly at a wedding after one too many drinks, you might feel closer to a Greek initiate than you realize. There's a strange comedy in how the Greeks sanctified what most societies would call a mess. Vomiting after too much wine wasn't shameful. It was practically part of the liturgy. Slurred words became prophecies. Stumbling steps became symbols of release. Where modern cultures might frown at losing control, the Greeks celebrated it as the very path to wisdom. In their eyes, you didn't discover the divine by thinking harder. You found it by forgetting yourself entirely. That's a lesson we struggle with even now. We chase clarity, self-improvement, control. But maybe, just maybe, the Greeks were onto something when they suggested that sometimes the way forward is to let yourself unravel. The rituals always carried an undercurrent of danger. Frenzy could slip into violence, desire into chaos, and the collective energy could consume rather than liberate. Myths warned of maenads who, in their intoxicated devotion, tore apart animals or even men. To surrender completely was to flirt with madness, and that risk was part of the thrill. They understood that passion without restraint is as terrifying as it is intoxicating. It's the same uneasy truth we feel today watching crowds lose themselves at concerts or riots, that delicate moment when shared energy tips from celebration into something darker. The Greeks knew it, embraced it, and called it holy. By the time dawn broke, the fires burned low and the participants collapsed in exhaustion. They were no longer the same. They had been vessels of Dionysus, fragments of the divine storm, swept into a tide of wine, sweat, laughter, and release. They returned to their daily lives with sore feet and pounding heads, but also with the memory of ecstasy, the knowledge that for a few hours they had dissolved into something infinite, and perhaps that memory was the real purpose all along, not the intoxication itself, but the lingering ache of having touched a truth too wild to explain, a truth that left them hungrier for the next time the god would call them back into the firelight. The Greeks had a way of turning even the most ordinary substance into something divine, and nowhere is that clearer than in their relationship with wine. They didn't just drink it, they treated it as a portal, a key that unlocked hidden doors inside the human spirit. When the cup was passed around in the glow of torchlight, it wasn't simply about loosening the tongue or warming the chest. It was about dissolving the barriers between body and soul, human and God, order and chaos. A sober man was a man bound by society's chains. A drunk man, however, could claim he was touched by Dionysus. It's hard not to laugh at the brilliance of that logic. Imagine coming home after a wild night out and saying, "I wasn't wasted. I was communing with the divine." Somehow, in ancient Greece, that excuse might have actually worked. Yet it wasn't just the drinking that carried symbolic weight. The very act of sharing wine from a common vessel turned strangers into kin. Each sip was a reminder that ecstasy was not meant to be hoarded but experienced together. Community was forged in the spilling of goblets, in laughter that rose too loudly, in bodies swaying closer than the rules of the polis normally allowed. The wine was thick with meaning. It symbolized fertility, vitality, and the life force that pulsed through every ritual. And when it flowed too freely, it symbolized something else entirely, the fragility of control. After all, you can carefully plan your prayer, your procession, your hymn, but once wine enters the bloodstream, all plans go out the window. Perhaps that's the point, a ritual that forces you to abandon the illusion that you're in charge. What made these ceremonies compelling was how they layered pleasure with danger. Wine was sweet, but it could also tip into poison. Ecstasy felt divine, but it could easily spill into madness. The Greeks didn't shy away from this tension. They embraced it. Dionysus himself embodied contradiction, the god who brought joy and terror in the same breath. His devotees mirrored that paradox, laughing until they cried, dancing until they collapsed, worshiping until they forgot their own names. This wasn't just indulgence for indulgence's sake. It was a kind of rehearsal for life's unpredictability. Because isn't existence itself a balance between pleasure and peril, between the order we cling to and the chaos that inevitably sweeps us away? The Greeks simply staged that truth under the stars with wine-stained lips. The sensory details mattered. Torches smoked and hissed, casting shadows that danced along the walls like living spirits. The smell of spilled wine mixed with sweat and incense, a pungent perfume of devotion. Feet thudded against packed earth, arms tangled, voices rose in hymns that were half sung, half slurred. To an outsider, it might have looked like a rowdy party spiraling out of control. To the insider, it was nothing less than the presence of the divine. Every stumble, every shout, every embrace was sanctified. The sacred was not distant and untouchable. It was messy, intoxicating, embarrassingly human. And that was exactly the point. There's a strange kind of comedy in how much trust was placed in the drink. Wine was expected to elevate, to connect, to heal, but also to test. People joked that Dionysus lived in the bottom of the cup, but perhaps he also lingered in the hangover, in the groggy morning when the god's presence felt less like inspiration and more like punishment. Still, even that was folded into the ritual. Suffering after ecstasy only deepened its significance, like the land needing to dry after a flood before it could bear fruit again. The Greeks understood that joy and pain were siblings, always arriving together, no matter how much you wished otherwise. And through all of it, sexuality pulsed beneath the surface. Intoxication was not only about loosening the mind, but also loosening the body. Wine blurred lines, made inhibitions dissolve, turned glances into touches and touches into something more. In the rituals, this was not shameful, but sacred. The merging of bodies was seen as an extension of the merging of souls, another step closer to the gods themselves. Desire became prayer, passion became offering. It was a theology you could taste, a faith that left you dizzy but somehow closer to eternity. By the time the fires dimmed and the chants gave way to murmurs, participants were spent, lying in tangled heaps of robes and wreaths, the air heavy with the aftermath of excess. And yet, in that exhaustion, in that disheveled vulnerability, they felt renewed. The rituals had stripped them down to raw humanity and then built them up again with the promise that they had touched something larger than themselves. They rose the next day with pounding heads and sore limbs, but also with a story of the night they stepped outside their roles, outside their names, and let the god of frenzy guide them. And maybe that story, retold in whispers or laughter, was the real magic all along, the memory of surrender lingering long after the last drop of wine had dried from their lips. When night fell over Greece and the last of the sunlight slipped behind the hills, certain rituals moved away from the open plazas and marble courtyards into places far more hidden. Caves, groves, and secluded temple chambers became the stage for ceremonies that carried layers of secrecy. The darkness itself was part of the rite. It stripped away the certainty of sight and heightened every sound, every touch, every breath. The Greeks understood that mystery was a powerful ingredient. What you cannot see feels larger than life, and what you cannot fully understand becomes sacred. To step into one of these hidden rituals was to abandon the familiar and submit to a world where the line between human and divine blurred in ways both beautiful and unsettling. In these spaces, torches flickered against rough stone walls, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. The air was heavy with incense, sometimes sweet, sometimes choking, and always meant to disorient. Music seeped into the ears, flutes playing notes that swirled like smoke, drums pounding in rhythms that made the chest vibrate. And then there were the voices, chanting in patterns that felt hypnotic, words that only the initiated were meant to understand. Outsiders might have dismissed it as noise, but for those inside, it was the language of transformation. Every sense was manipulated to push the mind past its limits. Imagine walking into a room designed to overwhelm you, where every detail screamed, "Leave your ordinary self behind." That was the purpose. The sexuality woven into these moments was inseparable from the secrecy. Acts that might have been shocking in the daylight became essential under the cover of shadows. Masks were often worn, not only to hide identity, but to symbolize stepping out of individuality. When faces disappeared behind painted expressions, what remained were bodies acting as instruments of cosmic drama. The anonymity was freeing, allowing people to surrender to desires they might never confess in ordinary life. It's not hard to see the appeal. Modern life still carries a shadow of this in masquerade, balls, nightclubs, or even digital anonymity, where masks, whether literal or metaphorical, make us feel braver about our hidden impulses. The Greeks just perfected the art of turning it into liturgy. One of the most intriguing elements of these hidden rites was the use of symbolic objects. Phallic statues, carved fruits, and vessels shaped like parts of the human body were paraded, touched, sometimes even kissed, as though the act itself could draw fertility into the community. To laugh at such imagery was unthinkable. It was serious business. Yet it's difficult not to imagine the suppressed smirks of some participants. Humans are humans, after all. Someone must have rolled their eyes while solemnly kissing a wooden symbol. But that's what gave the rituals their power, the ability to take the most basic realities of life, sex, fertility, desire, and elevate them into the realm of the divine. There were also initiatory trials, moments where new participants were deliberately tested. They might be left in darkness, forced to recite chants, or pushed to endure hunger, intoxication, or exhaustion, before being allowed into the heart of the rite. These ordeals were meant to break the ordinary self, to shatter the idea of individuality until the initiate became clay ready to be reshaped. And in that vulnerable state, sexuality was introduced not just as pleasure, but as revelation. To embrace another body was to embrace the gods. To lose oneself in touch and sensation was to lose oneself in the divine. It was not about romance. It was about becoming part of something larger, something infinite. The secrecy also created its own economy of power. Those who knew what happened inside the caves and chambers held prestige over those who didn't. Mystery breeds authority. To be initiated was to carry a badge of honor, to belong to an inner circle that could look at outsiders with a knowing smile. It is the same psychology that makes exclusive clubs or hidden societies so enticing today. People crave access to what others are denied. The Greeks, keen observers of human nature, built their religions around that craving, turning secrecy into spirituality and desire into doctrine. Of course, such hidden rites sparked scandal and rumor. Outsiders accused participants of unspeakable acts, painting the rituals as depravity disguised as piety. Some of those rumors were exaggerations, some were truth wrapped in metaphor. The beauty of secrecy is that it feeds the imagination. People on the outside always imagine worse than what really happens inside. And in that exaggeration, the rituals gained even more allure. After all, if people are gossiping about what you're doing, it only makes it seem more powerful. The Greeks seemed to understand this paradox instinctively, and through all of this, the core idea remained the same. To transcend ordinary human existence, you had to cross the boundaries of shame, fear, and even reason. These hidden rituals were not simply indulgence in the dark. They were deliberate journeys into the parts of the self that daylight tried to repress. Participants came out of them feeling changed, sometimes shaken, but always convinced they had touched something untouchable. That conviction alone gave the rites their power. By morning, the caves were silent again, the groves empty, the temple chambers cleared of incense. But for those who had taken part, the memory lingered like a shadow behind the eyes, a secret carried in the body as much as in the mind. They returned to their daily roles, speaking little of what had happened, but walking with the certainty that they belonged to a mystery larger than themselves. And perhaps that was the most intoxicating part of all, that sense of carrying a secret no one else could quite imagine. A secret that whispered of gods, desire, and the wild freedom that only darkness allows. The Greeks had an extraordinary gift for storytelling, and nowhere was this clearer than in the myths that underpinned their most intimate rituals. They didn't separate myth from life. They lived it, breathed it, and enacted it through their ceremonies. To them, a sexual rite was not simply an indulgence, but the reenactment of stories that explained why the world even existed. When initiates embraced one another in candlelit chambers, they weren't just humans lost in passion. They were playing the roles of gods whose unions had once birthed mountains, rivers, and entire generations of deities. The act was theater, but not for entertainment. It was cosmic theater, a performance in which every participant believed themselves to be part of creation itself. Take, for example, the myth of Gaia and Uranus, the earth and the sky. Their eternal embrace produced the first beings, but their conflict also birthed chaos. To the Greeks, their story was not just bedtime mythology. It was the model of fertility and strife that echoed in every union. When men and women met in ritualized intimacy, they were retelling that myth with their bodies, fusing heaven and earth for a fleeting moment. It was an attempt to align human action with divine origin, to make sure the crops grew and the children were born. There's something both awe-inspiring and amusing in this idea. Imagine looking at your own relationship and realizing the Greeks would have seen it as a cosmic allegory. Honey, we aren't just arguing about dinner, we're reenacting the eternal struggle of sky and earth. Other myths found their way into rituals too. The story of Persephone in Hades, for instance, with its themes of abduction, loss, and return, was often linked to cycles of fertility and rebirth. Some rites symbolically enacted this descent into darkness and return to light, often with initiates undergoing trials in darkened chambers before emerging into firelit celebrations. For the Greeks, even the unsettling aspects of mythology, violence, betrayal, desire, were necessary parts of the cycle of life. Nothing was off limits because everything was part of the human condition. If a god could lust, rage, betray, and still remain divine, then human impulses too could be seen as sacred. It was a strangely comforting thought that your flaws didn't exclude you from holiness, they confirmed your humanity. Dionysus himself was central to these narratives, the god who blurred every boundary. His myths told of transformation, of men turned into beasts, of women overtaken by divine frenzy, of the constant dance between ecstasy and terror. To embody Dionysus in ritual was to let go of control, to surrender to madness as a kind of wisdom. He represented the part of the human spirit that refuses to be tamed, the wildness that still lives in us no matter how polite we pretend to be. Picture the contradiction. A philosopher might spend his days debating logic and reason only to put on a garland at night and howl to the moon in honor of Dionysus. And yet, the Greeks saw no contradiction at all. To them, reason and madness were both divine gifts, each needed in its own time. The myths also made space for comedy. The Greeks didn't just revere their gods, they mocked them, laughed at them, retold their stories with bawdy humor that slipped easily into ritual. Songs at festivals often included obscene jokes, wordplay filled with innuendo, and stories that made even the gods blush. This mixture of reverence and ridicule was not sacrilege. It was balance. Laughter was as holy as solemnity, and sex could be hilarious as well as sacred. One can imagine a torch-lit circle where someone told a scandalous myth about Zeus's endless affairs, and the crowd burst into laughter while still believing they were honoring him. It's the same contradiction we live with today, telling jokes about sacred things while secretly hoping those sacred things are still watching over us. Through these mythic enactments, the Greeks created rituals that were not static but alive, filled with unpredictability and drama. Each ceremony was a living story, one that connected the participants to a lineage stretching back to the dawn of time. And the beauty of myth is that it works on multiple levels at once: literal, symbolic, and deeply personal. A young initiate might see themselves as Persephone entering darkness for the first time, while an older participant might feel they were Demeter, grieving and awaiting renewal. The same ritual could carry 1,000 meanings depending on who lived it. That flexibility gave the myths their power. They were never just stories. They were mirrors reflecting every stage of human life. And so, when the music swelled and the bodies moved in rhythm, when laughter mixed with gasps and the night air thickened with smoke and sweat, it wasn't only about what was happening in that moment. It was about replaying the eternal dramas that explained why the sun rose, why crops grew, why people lived and died and loved anyway. The participants were not just villagers or citizens anymore. For a brief span of hours, they were gods. They carried the myths in their flesh, and in doing so, they kept the world turning. And maybe that's the most fascinating part of all, that in the chaos of sex, song, and story, the Greeks believed they were holding together the fragile threads of the universe itself. There was a unique electricity in the atmosphere of Greek festivals, a blend of music, intoxication, and bodies pressed together under the night sky. These were not events for spectators. They were immersive worlds, where you were swallowed by sound, sight, and touch, until you forgot where you ended and the crowd began. The rhythms of drums throbbed like a second heartbeat. Flutes wailed in spirals, and chants rose in waves that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the human throat. People didn't just watch the ceremonies, they became part of them. You could be a farmer, a soldier, or even a philosopher trying to hold on to reason, but once the chants began and the torches flared, reason was swept away, and you were carried by a tide of ecstatic frenzy. Music wasn't decoration, it was the engine of transformation. The steady pounding of drums forced bodies into movement, breaking down stiffness until hips swayed and feet stamped in unison. Flutes and lyres wove melodies that teased emotions out of hiding, making participants laugh, cry, or collapse into trembling silence. When voices joined in chant, the sound was both chaotic and strangely ordered, pulling everyone into a shared trance. Imagine thousands of voices chanting the same name, the same phrases, until the air itself seemed to hum. It was hypnotic, overwhelming, designed to override thought and drag the body into surrender. Even today, you can feel a shadow of this at concerts or stadiums when thousands chant as one. The Greeks just took that raw energy and declared it divine. The choreography of these rites often involved spirals and circles, patterns that mirrored the cosmos itself. Participants danced until exhaustion, collapsing in heaps before being lifted back to their feet, only to continue again. Frenzy was not a side effect. It was the goal. To sweat, to pant, to lose control of limbs was to prove that the god had entered you. In the Dionysian rites especially, women known as maenads reached states of wild abandon, tearing through the night with unbound hair, their voices carrying into the hills. They were feared as much as they were admired, embodying freedom so radical it scared those who clung to order. It was liberation disguised as madness, and it frightened the sober world precisely because it revealed how fragile control really is. There was comedy too, tucked between the ecstasy and terror. Participants sang obscene songs, traded jokes laced with innuendo, and wore masks that exaggerated the absurdity of human desire. The Greeks believed laughter itself was holy, that humor had a place in worship as much as solemnity did. You might hear a sacred hymn followed immediately by a bawdy verse about Zeus and his endless affairs. To us, it sounds contradictory, but for them, it was balance. A ritual that only inspired fear or reverence was incomplete. It needed laughter to remind everyone that even the gods weren't above being mocked. In that sense, humor was the great equalizer, cutting through the intensity of the moment while still feeding into its energy. It's important to remember that not everyone who joined these rites did so with full confidence. Some arrived skeptical, stiff, worried about what would happen. But once they were surrounded by music, laughter, and frenzy, resistance melted. There is something disarming about being part of a crowd that's lost itself. You either surrender or stand outside. and standing outside meant missing the chance to touch the divine. Peer pressure, after all, is timeless. The Greeks simply turned it into theology. If your neighbor was stomping the ground, tearing their clothes, and claiming to be embraced by Dionysus, how long before you gave in too? By the end of the night, the participants were utterly spent. Their robes were torn, their hair tangled, their voices hoarse, but they didn't feel broken. They felt reborn. They had emptied themselves through song, dance, and ecstasy, and in doing so, made space for something larger. In the silence after the frenzy, when the last notes faded and only the crackle of dying torches remained, a profound stillness fell. It was in that silence that many believed the true presence of the gods revealed itself, not in the chaos, but in the afterglow. That quiet moment when bodies trembled and breaths slowed was where revelation lived. And that paradox, and the storm followed by the calm, was what gave the rituals their enduring power, ensuring people returned again and again, hungry to dissolve into the music, the laughter, and the mystery all over again. Secrecy was one of the greatest tools of Greek ritual, and it's impossible to understand these practices without stepping into the shadow of the mysteries. Unlike the public festivals where wine spilled into the streets and laughter echoed into the hills, there were rites reserved for those willing to walk into darkness and swear never to reveal what they had seen. The Eleusinian mysteries, among the most famous, drew thousands from across the Greek world, kings, slaves, women, men, all equal once they crossed the threshold. Imagine that, a society so obsessed with hierarchy suddenly leveling its own ranks inside a sanctuary. If you wanted a taste of true democracy in ancient Greece, it wasn't the assembly in Athens. It was in the hidden chambers where secrets were guarded like treasure. The initiation began long before the first torch was lit. Pilgrims prepared with fasting, purifications, and offerings, their anticipation building like a drumbeat in the chest. By the time they reached the sacred site, they were already primed for transformation. Fasting wasn't only about discipline, it was a way to heighten the senses, to make the body more receptive. Hunger sharpens perception, thirst makes water taste like wine, and anticipation turns every sound into a revelation. The Greeks knew this. They engineered the body into a state of longing so that when the ritual climax came, it struck with overwhelming force. You could call it manipulation, or you could call it genius. Either way, it worked. Once inside the sacred hall, initiates found themselves in an environment crafted for awe. Darkness pressed in, punctuated by sudden bursts of light, torches flaring, fires crackling, symbols revealed at just the right moment. Priests spoke words known only to the initiated, phrases that seemed meaningless to outsiders but dripped with significance for those who had prepared. The layering of sensory extremes, darkness and light, silence and sound, fear and joy, created a theater of transformation. Think of it as the original immersive experience, long before virtual reality. The Greeks didn't need headsets. They had ritual architects who understood psychology better than most modern therapists. Sexual symbolism was everywhere, though rarely spoken of directly. Grain was not just grain, torches not just torches, and water not just water. Every object hinted at fertility, rebirth, union. Myths of Demeter and Persephone formed the backbone, telling of descent into darkness and triumphant return. The drama was universal, but it also mirrored each initiate's personal journey, the symbolic death of who they were, and the rebirth of who they became. And while the language of myth cloaked everything, everyone in that chamber understood the subtext. Life renews itself through union, through cycles of fertility, through the same forces that drive desire in every human heart. It was holy, but it was also deeply physical. The secrecy surrounding these rituals only amplified their impact. People left transformed, unable or unwilling to share exactly what had happened. That silence created power. Outsiders speculated wildly, some imagining orgies in torchlit chambers, others convinced participants had seen visions of the gods themselves. Both explanations carried some truth, but the mystery was the real glue. When you don't know exactly what happens behind closed doors, your imagination fills in the blanks, and the result is often more powerful than reality. The Greeks mastered this psychology, keeping generations hooked on rituals whose details could never be fully grasped. And there's a humorous irony here. For all the grand secrecy, most initiates probably experienced something that was a mix of awe and awkwardness. Picture standing in a crowded, smoky hall, shoulder to shoulder with strangers, waiting for a priest to lift an object that you're told will change your life. Did everyone feel divine revelation in that moment? Probably not. Some must have thought, "This is it? I starved for 3 days for this?" And yet, even those skeptics left convinced that something sacred had happened, because the group's conviction was unshakable. Belief is contagious, and the Greeks harnessed that contagion with unmatched brilliance. What makes these hidden ceremonies so enduring in memory is how they tapped into universal human desires, the longing to belong, the need for transformation, the fear of death, and the hope of renewal. By dramatizing these truths with myth, music, light, and secrecy, they turned simple human anxieties into spiritual theater. And at the heart of it all was the body, hungry, trembling, intoxicated, aroused, exhausted. Flesh was never excluded. It was the stage on which divinity performed. When initiates stepped back into the daylight, they weren't just citizens anymore. They were carriers of a secret, bound together by an invisible thread of shared experience. Their eyes carried the glimmer of those torch-lit moments. Their voices softened when speaking of what they had endured. The transformation lingered, not because of what they had literally seen, but because of what they believed it meant. That belief shaped lives, gave courage in times of war, comfort in grief, and hope in the face of death. And perhaps that was the greatest magic of all, that in the silence of secrecy and the chaos of ritual, the Greeks found a way to turn ordinary men and women into walking mysteries themselves. Among the most fascinating aspects of Greek ritual life were the fertility cults that made no attempt to disguise their purpose. They existed to coax the earth into abundance, to ensure that seeds sprouted, herds multiplied, and families thrived. Yet the way they pursued these goals was anything but straightforward. Rituals were saturated with sexual imagery, from phallic processions to sacred unions, staged as theatrical reenactments of divine myths. To walk into such a festival was to step into a living metaphor, where every object, gesture, and body part had a double meaning. The Greeks turned agriculture into erotica, but not out of frivolity. It was their way of stitching together human desire and the cycles of nature. One of the most striking customs was the phallic parade, where enormous carved symbols were carried through the streets with cheering and laughter. To modern eyes, it looks absurd, almost comedic, but to the Greeks, these objects were living prayers. They embodied potency, the power to generate life not only in the bedroom, but in the soil itself. Farmers joined the procession, hoping their fields would be blessed. Women watched with nervous laughter, and children probably asked far too many awkward questions their parents weren't ready to answer. It was both spectacle and supplication, comedy and devotion, the sacred hidden in plain sight. Sacred unions were another centerpiece. Priests or chosen participants acted out the marriage of a god and goddess, often in front of an audience. These unions could be symbolic, represented by rituals involving grain, wine, and torches, but sometimes they were dramatized in ways that blurred the line between theater and reality. To the Greeks, reenacting the union of sky and earth, or of Dionysus and Aphrodite, was more than performance. It was an act of sympathetic magic, a way of compelling the earth to mirror divine fertility. It raises the question, did they truly believe the gods cared about these dramatizations? Or did they understand that the real power lay in the psychological effect it had on the community? Perhaps both. After all, if everyone leaves, convinced the harvest will thrive, isn't that belief itself a kind of fuel? The laughter that accompanied these rituals was intentional. Obscene jokes, ribald songs, and exaggerated costumes weren't accidents. They were woven into the ceremonies because the Greeks believed joy and fertility were linked. Laughter loosened the spirit, released tension, and opened people to abundance. In fact, some rites explicitly demanded participants to laugh, as if to remind everyone that life's continuance required not only solemnity but playfulness. Think about it. They treated laughter as holy, a necessary ingredient in worship. That's a perspective modern cultures might envy. Instead of dividing sacred and comic, the Greeks wove them together, reminding us that sometimes a joke carries more power than a prayer. Even agricultural tasks were drawn into the erotic tapestry. Sowing seeds became a metaphor for male fertility, the furrows of the field described in language that left little doubt about their symbolic meaning. Harvest festivals often included dances that mimicked acts of union, reminding everyone that their survival depended on rhythms of a life far more ancient than any temple. There's something disarming about this honesty. Where we might cloak fertility in euphemisms, the Greeks embraced it openly, boldly, even humorously. They understood that without sex there was no life, and without laughter there was no joy. By combining both, they ensured that their rituals were not only effective, but unforgettable. Curiously, these fertility rites also gave unusual visibility to women. Priestesses often led key aspects, embodying the goddesses whose union with male deities sustained creation. In these moments, women weren't confined to domestic silence. They were central to cosmic drama. Their bodies, their voices, their laughter carried the weight of divine representation. Of course, once the festival ended, social hierarchies snapped back into place, but the memory lingered. Perhaps that fleeting empowerment was part of the attraction. For a night or a season, women could step into roles usually denied them, channeling the divine feminine with unrestrained authority. Foreign visitors were often scandalized by these fertility celebrations, writing about them with a mix of fascination and disgust. To outsiders, the blending of obscenity and worship looked like decadence. But to the Greeks, it was a kind of wisdom, an acknowledgement that the divine was not distant and pure, but immediate, earthy, and as messy as human desire. The rituals reflected a worldview that refused to sanitize life's most basic realities. Instead, they embraced them, laughed at them, and offered them to the gods. And maybe that's the enduring lesson, that to truly honor life, you must be willing to celebrate not only its solemn beauty, but its raw absurdity. As the festivals closed, the carved symbols were put away. The torches dimmed and the fields awaited their planting. But in the hearts of participants, the memory of laughter, song, and shared abandon remained. It wasn't just about crops or herds. It was about feeling connected to the pulse of creation itself. To know that your laughter, your body, your very breath could be part of a cosmic cycle was intoxicating in a way no wine could match. And that lingering intoxication, carried back into ordinary life, was what made people return year after year. Because once you've danced at the edge of mystery with both reverence and laughter, how could you not crave it again? In the Greek imagination, the divine was never locked away in some distant heaven. The gods walked among mortals, not just in myths, but in rituals where humans acted as their stand-ins. Nowhere was this more evident than in the sacred unions performed as part of religious rites. These were not ordinary marriages. They were cosmic reenactments of the bond between gods and goddesses, where the act of union itself was believed to sustain the world. The Greeks took the messy, unpredictable reality of human intimacy and clothed it in divine symbolism, convincing themselves that the embrace of two bodies could echo across heaven and earth. It was theater, magic, and theology all tangled into one. The most famous example was the Hieros Gamos, the sacred marriage, often performed in spring to mark the renewal of life. The chosen pair might represent Zeus and Hera or other divine couples embodying their union in front of a watching community. Sometimes the ritual was symbolic, with offerings of grain and wine standing in for a physical consummation. But in other cases, the suggestion of real intimacy hovered in the air, cloaked by the shadows of night and the secrecy of the temple. The ambiguity was the point. What mattered was not whether the act literally took place, but that everyone believed the universe had just been reset through it. If you think about it, this is religious marketing genius. Sell the idea of cosmic harmony through the simple, universal language of attraction. These unions were never private matters. They unfolded in carefully staged ceremonies, often with music, dancing, and chanting to heighten the drama. Participants didn't see two people. They saw the sky bending to meet the earth, the rains fertilizing the soil, the eternal return of abundance. To an outsider, it might look scandalous, but to those within the culture, it was reassurance. If the gods kept uniting, the world would keep spinning. What better insurance policy could a community ask for? It's a bit like watching a play every year that convinces you the sun won't forget to rise tomorrow. There was a heavy layer of comedy, too. Greek culture thrived on humor even in the most solemn moments, and fertility rites were sprinkled with ribald jokes, songs full of innuendo, and performances that made the audience laugh, even as they nodded in reverence. The union of gods was holy, yes, but it was also absurd, because desire itself is absurd. One moment it feels transcendent, the next it makes you trip over your own sandals. The Greeks leaned into that contradiction. Their rituals reminded people that to laugh at love was not to dishonor it, but to acknowledge its power over us. After all, what else can you do when you're caught between the sacred and the ridiculous? These ceremonies also reflected deep anxieties about control. The Greeks feared famine, infertility, and disease, and sacred unions offered a way to imagine that they could influence forces far beyond their grasp. If the priest and priestess embodied divine lovers, perhaps the fields would bear fruit, the herds would multiply, the children would thrive. It was a form of sympathetic magic. Do here what you hope the gods will do up there. And while modern science might roll its eyes at the logic, it's worth asking, are we really so different? We still perform symbolic acts, from cutting cakes at weddings to clinking glasses for luck, all in the hope that ritual can shape reality. The Greeks simply pushed the metaphor further, giving their ceremonies a cosmic backdrop. At times, these unions blurred the line between ritual and politics. To preside over a sacred marriage was to hold immense power, to be seen as the vessel of divine union. Leaders and priests used this association strategically, bolstering their authority by claiming to embody gods themselves. It was less about personal intimacy than about legitimizing rule through cosmic symbolism. When you think about it, politics has always had a flair for theater, and the Greeks perfected it by turning divine love stories into state-sponsored drama. Maybe that's why power and sex have always seemed so intertwined, because long before scandals filled tabloids, they were being staged under the stars in honor of Olympus. Yet, beneath all the spectacle, there was something tender in the idea that human union could mirror divine love. These rituals reminded participants that intimacy, however flawed and fleeting, was also part of the grand design. The gods themselves fought, betrayed, and wandered into forbidden desires, but their unions still held the cosmos together. In that sense, the Greeks gave people permission to see their own struggles with love not as failures, but as echoes of divine drama. To be messy in love was to be human, and to be human was to be closer to the gods than anyone dared admit. By the time the torches dimmed and the laughter faded, participants left with the quiet certainty that their world was safe for another cycle. The sacred union had been renewed, the gods had smiled once more, and life could continue. What lingered wasn't just the spectacle, but the sense that they had touched something eternal through something profoundly ordinary. And perhaps that was the greatest revelation, that the divine was never far away, but hidden in the gestures, bodies, and desires that bound people together night after night, season after season, life after life. The Greeks had a talent for turning the ordinary act of gathering together into something that pulsed with layers of meaning. Communal feasting, for them, was never just about filling the belly. It was about weaving a web of connection, about dissolving barriers between citizen and stranger, host and guest, human and divine. When people reclined at low tables, dipping bread into shared bowls and passing wine cups from hand to hand, they weren't only eating, they were performing a ritual that reinforced identity and community. And yet, as with all things Greek, desire was always present, sometimes simmering beneath the surface, sometimes bursting out in plain view. The banquet hall itself was a stage. Long couches lined the walls, oil lamps flickered against painted frescoes, and the air smelled of roasted meat, honey cakes, and the resin of spilled wine. Musicians strummed lyres, dancers moved between the tables, and jugglers or storytellers filled pauses between courses. It was noisy, chaotic, a swirl of laughter and song. And in the center of it all was the crater, the great mixing bowl of wine and water that symbolized shared intoxication. To dip your cup into that vessel was to agree, silently, that everyone present was bound together by the same flood of pleasure. Think of it as the ancient version of saying, we're all in this together. Except instead of posting a hashtag, you proved it by getting equally tipsy. Desire was woven into every gesture. A glance across the room could spark a story. A brush of fingers while passing a cup could become a promise. The Greeks did not draw harsh lines between eating, drinking, and flirting. To them, all were part of the same continuum of pleasure, different shades of the same longing for connection. And while the hosts offered food to appease hunger, they also offered space for eyes to meet, for whispers to rise above the clamor, for bodies to inch closer under the cover of celebration. One might call it multitasking. Feed the body, stir the spirit, tempt the heart, all at the same time. These feasts blurred social boundaries in fascinating ways. Though Greek society was rigidly stratified, at the banquet table, roles could shift. Philosophers might argue with soldiers, merchants with poets, courtesans with aristocrats. For a night, the categories softened, replaced by the simple fact of being present, of sharing wine and stories. Of course, hierarchy always found its way back into the picture. Who sat closer to the host, who was offered the choicest cuts. But the very act of reclining together gave the illusion of equality. And perhaps that illusion was enough. Isn't it still true today? Whether in a boardroom dinner or a family barbecue, people cling to the idea that food makes us equals, even if the seating arrangement says otherwise. The sexual undercurrents at these gatherings were impossible to ignore. Music and dance weren't merely entertainment, they were invitations. Courtesans were often present, their laughter as carefully crafted as their songs, offering not only companionship, but the suggestion of intimacy. Youths were celebrated too, their beauty openly admired in ways that startled later societies. The Greeks saw no contradiction between praising the symmetry of a young man's body and debating Plato's theory of forms in the same breath. Desire for them was not a distraction from intellectual or spiritual life, it was a complement. A person could be aroused and enlightened at once, and they often were. Comedy always found its seat at the table. Between solemn toasts to the gods and lofty debates about philosophy, someone would crack a joke, usually crude enough to make even Dionysus chuckle. Humor was more than levity. It was release. The Greeks understood that laughter oils the gears of social interaction, smoothing over awkward silences and giving permission to let go. Imagine trying to maintain stoic dignity while reclining on a couch with wine dripping down your chin. At some point, someone had to laugh, and when they did, the whole room followed. Laughter was sacred because it reminded everyone not to take themselves too seriously, and in that surrender, bonds were formed as strong as any oath. The food itself carried meaning. Bread was not just bread, it was the fruit of Demeter's gift. Wine was not just wine, it was Dionysus liquefied. Even the act of mixing wine with water held symbolism, the balance between ecstasy and moderation, chaos and order. To drink unmixed wine was barbaric, a surrender to frenzy without structure. To drink properly mixed wine was to honor both impulse and restraint. Isn't that the eternal human struggle? How much chaos do we allow into our carefully ordered lives before it tips into destruction? The Greeks turned that question into a recipe. 3 parts water, 1 part wine. Enough to loosen the tongue, not enough to lose the room. And as the night deepened, as voices slurred and bodies leaned heavier into couches, the lines between sacred and profane blurred further. Prayers were offered to the gods, but so were kisses to neighbors. Songs veered from hymns to bawdy verses without anyone blinking. It was all one ritual, one expression of the fullness of life. When dawn finally approached and the lamps guttered out, participants stumbled back into the streets with sore heads and aching limbs, but also with the memory of connection, They had eaten together, laughed together, desired together, worshipped together. And in that memory lay the real magic. Not the food, not the wine, but the sense that for a few hours the walls of society had cracked open and revealed something raw, absurd, and profoundly human. That memory lingered longer than the taste of wine or the smell of roasted lamb. It lived in the stories retold the next day, in the laughter that bubbled at the recollection of a joke, in the heat of a glance remembered from across the table. And that lingering power was why people returned again and again, because once you've touched a moment where eating, drinking, desire, and divinity all blur into one, ordinary meals feel unbearably flat. The Greeks knew this, and so they kept weaving their feasts into the fabric of life, turning every banquet into a rehearsal for the ecstasy and chaos of existence itself. In ancient Greece, religion was never something you only encountered in marble temples or during public festivals. It was woven into the fabric of daily life, sometimes in the most unexpected and intimate places. The home itself became a sacred site. And within its walls, private rituals often carried layers of erotic undertones that might seem surprising today. To the Greeks, desire wasn't simply a matter of private indulgence. It was a force that shaped families, communities, and even the favor of the gods. Every flicker of the household flame or pouring of wine could carry meanings tied to fertility, prosperity, and the continuity of life. It was as if their kitchens and bedrooms were miniature temples where the most personal acts became extensions of cosmic drama. At the heart of many homes was the hearth, dedicated to Hestia, the goddess of the household flame. This fire was never allowed to die because its extinguishing symbolized the death of the family line itself. Newlyweds would often carry embers from their parents' hearth to ignite their own, a ritual that combined domestic duty with the symbolic union of fertility. It's not difficult to imagine how many whispered glances and private prayers were wrapped up in such a moment, hopes for children, prosperity, and a household filled with life. The simple act of lighting a fire carried undertones that stretched far beyond survival. It was a spark meant to ignite desire, growth, and continuity. Marriage ceremonies, too, were drenched in symbolism that blurred the sacred and the erotic. The procession of the bride often included torches, not just to light the way, but to represent the transfer of fertility from one household to another. Songs were sung, some solemn, some playfully obscene, as though the community couldn't resist mixing reverence with humor. On the wedding night, the chamber itself became a ritual space where the couple's union was more than personal. It was a reenactment of divine archetypes. The marriage bed wasn't just furniture, it was an altar. It's both poetic and amusing to realize that the Greeks took what most cultures treated as private and transformed it into an act heavy with cosmic significance. If you ever felt your in-laws were too involved in your love life, imagine living in a society where your first night together was basically a public theological event. Even the rituals around food and drink carried erotic weight. The pouring of wine wasn't simply hospitality, it echoed the fertility of Dionysus, the god who blurred the line between intoxication and intimacy. Offerings of bread, fruit, and honey cakes weren't just about feeding the gods, they symbolized the sweetness and abundance of union. Eating together after ritual often became foreplay, cloaked as piety, a reminder that sustenance and desire were intertwined. It seems the Greeks never allowed their meals to be just meals. They had to be metaphors too. Perhaps that's why their feasts linger in memory, not just as dining experiences, but as stages where pleasure and worship were indistinguishable. Household altars often included fertility charms, statues of Priapus with exaggerated features, or small offerings shaped in ways that left little to the imagination. These objects were not jokes, though they must have provoked plenty of chuckles. They were talismans of abundance, reminders that the body's generative power was sacred. Neighbors would borrow them, families would pass them down, and everyone pretended not to smirk while placing them on the shelf. But beneath the humor was a profound truth. Survival depended on fertility, and fertility depended on honoring the forces that inspired desire. It's difficult not to admire a culture that could keep a straight face while decorating their homes with symbols that today would probably be hidden in a drawer. There were also rites of passage within the household that carried erotic undertones, especially for young men and women approaching adulthood. Coming-of-age ceremonies often included offerings to gods and goddesses of love and fertility, prayers whispered at the threshold of new stages in life. These moments were less about explicit acts and more about acknowledging desire as a natural force that would shape their futures. Families watched nervously, no doubt remembering their own youth, while pretending to treat the whole thing with solemn seriousness. It's one of those cultural situations where everyone knows what's really being acknowledged, but no one dares to say it out loud. The intimacy of these household rituals often made them more powerful than public festivals. In a crowded temple, you might feel lost in the masses, but at home, every gesture was personal. Lighting the lamp, sharing the bed, pouring the wine, these became offerings that tied the individual body to the cosmos. And perhaps that's what made them unforgettable. The realization that divinity wasn't only something you visited on holy days, but something that lived in your kitchen, your hearth, and your bed. The line between sacred and sensual blurred so completely that people didn't bother separating them at all. It's tempting to see these practices as quaint, but they speak to something universal. Even today, we give special weight to small domestic rituals, lighting candles, clinking glasses, sharing meals, acts that mean far more than they appear to. The Greeks simply had the honesty to admit what those gestures always carried beneath the surface, that desire and devotion, laughter and solemnity, survival and pleasure are all part of the same dance. And once you see that, it becomes impossible to look at even the simplest household flame without feeling the heat of something far larger flickering in the background. The Greeks were masters of turning the act of storytelling into ritual, and nowhere was this more powerful than in the symposium. On the surface, it looked like a drinking party, men reclining on couches, servants filling cups, music in the background. But beneath the haze of wine, the symposium was a theater for ideas, poetry, and seduction. Here, conversation itself became a kind of intimacy, where desire moved as much through words as through glances. Imagine a room filled with the scent of wine and burning oil, where a witty phrase or a well-placed compliment could be as intoxicating as the strongest vintage. The symposium was proof that desire did not always begin with bodies. It began with words that struck the mind like sparks on dry wood. Poets were the stars of these gatherings, their verses weaving together themes of love, longing, and loss. To recite Sappho under the soft glow of lamplight was to invite the audience into a world where every line carried the weight of hidden desire. Her fragments, filled with raw intimacy, became the soundtrack of countless evenings, whispered between gulps of wine and bursts of laughter. For the Greeks, poetry wasn't a distraction from passion. It was passion distilled. To hear a verse about longing was to feel it awaken in yourself, proof that words could touch places even hands could not. And perhaps that's why poetry thrived in these spaces. It gave people permission to feel openly what they might otherwise keep buried. Philosophers, too, took their place in this theater of desire. Plato's Symposium famously turned the drinking party into a debate on the nature of love, layering humor and seriousness in equal measure. Socrates might argue about the soul's yearning for truth, while another guest leaned in to murmur about the beauty of a young companion reclining nearby. High ideals and low impulses collided in the same breath, as if the Greeks were reminding themselves that even the loftiest discussions were never far from the pull of the body. It's amusing, really. Imagine debating the eternal forms of love while struggling not to spill wine on your neighbor's cloak. But perhaps that contrast was the point. Love is both transcendent and clumsy, sublime and ridiculous, and the symposium embraced all of it at once. Desire was not hidden in these gatherings. It was cultivated. The way wine was mixed, the order of songs sung, even the games played with cups and dice were designed to stoke the atmosphere of playful intimacy. Flirting was expected, glances exchanged like offerings, compliments wrapped in witty banter. The Greeks seem to understand something we often forget, that seduction is not always about immediate gratification. Sometimes it's about creating a world where everyone feels the pulse of desire in the air, even if nothing happens outright. The suspense, the possibility, was part of the intoxication. And in that sense, the symposium was less about what was consumed and more about what was stirred within. Laughter was indispensable. Between the solemn verses and philosophical speeches came jokes, often crude, always bold, that cut through the haze of wine. Guests wore garlands of ivy or roses, sang ribald songs, and competed in contests of wit where the loser might end up singing naked or balancing on one foot while drinking. It was ridiculous, but it was also freeing. By lowering the guardrails of propriety, humor created space where honesty could slip through. A drunken joke could reveal true feelings. A bawdy song could disguise a confession. The Greeks were clever enough to know that sometimes truth hides in laughter more easily than in solemn declarations. The presence of courtesans and companions added another layer. These women and men were more than entertainers. They were partners in conversation, skilled in music, poetry, and the art of charm. Their presence blurred the line between professional intimacy and genuine affection, reminding everyone that desire can never be fully contained within categories. Some fell in love, others merely enjoyed the illusion, but all participated in the dance. And isn't that what love often is? A performance that feels real precisely because we want it to be? As the night wore on and the lamps dimmed, the symposium shifted. The laughter grew louder, the debates more tangled, the verses slurred but heartfelt. Some drifted into sleep, others into quiet corners, while the most devoted lingered until dawn, still chasing the sweet spot where wine, words, and desire fused into one. By morning, the couches were littered with garlands, the floor sticky with spilled wine, and yet participants carried away something more enduring than a hangover. They carried the memory of being part of a ritual where body, mind, and spirit touched without needing to be separated. And perhaps that is why the symposium has remained such a powerful symbol. It was never just about drinking or even about sex. It It was about the endless search for connection, whether through a kiss, a poem, or a philosophical debate that made your heart race as much as your pulse. The Greeks recognized that desire takes many forms, and they had the courage to embrace all of them at once. It leaves us with a question that still lingers today. If conversation itself can stir longing, then maybe the most powerful unions are not only those of bodies, but of minds daring to meet in the glow of shared words and wine. The Greeks were never shy about the power of performance. To them, theater was not just entertainment, it was a sacred act, a communal ritual that touched politics, religion, and the deepest recesses of desire. When audiences gathered in open-air amphitheaters under the sun, they weren't simply watching stories, they were participating in them. The actors who strode onto the stage carried masks that were more than costumes. They were conduits for gods, heroes, and impulses that people dared not name in ordinary life. And within those masks and movements often hid erotic undertones, subtle gestures, and suggestive dances that stirred the audience in ways both thrilling and unsettling. Drama itself was born from festivals honoring Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and all things unrestrained. That should already tell you everything. Imagine creating an art form in honor of the god who encouraged people to lose themselves. It's no wonder the plays oscillated between tragic laments and bawdy comedies, between noble speeches and lewd innuendo. The Greeks didn't compartmentalize human experience. They spilled it all onto the stage. And if an actor's exaggerated hip sway or comic costume made the crowd burst into laughter tinged with desire, that was part of the magic. Comedy, in particular, thrived on the erotic. Aristophanes, the master of old comedy, filled his plays with jokes that would make modern audiences blush. Characters strutted across the stage with oversized phallic props. Women plotted to withhold sex as a form of political protest. And choruses sang verses dripping with innuendo. Audiences roared, not just because it was funny, but because it was liberating. In a society often bound by rigid rules of citizenship and propriety, comedy gave permission to laugh at the absurdity of it all. And isn't it still true that the quickest way to expose hypocrisy is through a joke? Even tragedy carried erotic weight, though it was often more subtle. Consider the plays where forbidden desires drive the plot, where passion leads to downfall, where love becomes entangled with death. The Greeks understood that desire is not always comic. It can also be catastrophic. Watching a queen fall for her stepson or a king destroyed by longing for power was not only cathartic, but uncomfortably relatable. Desire, they suggested, is never a side note. It's the thread that unravels lives. And yet, as the chorus sang and the actors cried out beneath their masks, the audience couldn't look away. They felt purged, cleansed, as though confronting the extremes of passion on stage kept those extremes from overwhelming their own lives. Dance was no less central. In religious rituals, dancers whirled in circles, stamping feet and shaking hips in patterns that mirrored cosmic cycles. Some movements were unmistakably erotic, performed with an abandon that seemed to invite the gods themselves into the body. Men and women danced together in rites of fertility, their gestures symbolic yet charged, their rhythm echoing the pulse of desire. To watch such dances was to witness more than performance. It was to see human bodies transformed into living prayers, and sometimes the line between prayer and seduction blurred so completely that no one cared to separate them. Music added its own spell. The flute, with its haunting, breathy notes, was associated with ecstasy and often accompanied erotic performances. The lyre, more delicate, gave voice to longing, its strings vibrating with the same tension that lived in the human heart. Imagine reclining at a symposium while a courtesan plucked soft melodies, each note carrying the weight of unspoken desire. The Greeks knew what we often forget, that sound can touch us in places words cannot reach, stirring memories and cravings we didn't know we carried. But perhaps the most telling sign of how performance and desire intertwined was the way audiences responded. They didn't sit stiffly in silence as we often do in modern theaters. They shouted, laughed, wept, and sometimes joined in. The theater was alive, and its energy flowed both ways. Actors feeding off the crowd feeding off the actors. That collective participation created an intimacy, not just between performers and audience, but among the spectators themselves. A shared laugh at a crude joke or a collective gasp at a forbidden kiss forged bonds that lasted long after the play ended. There's an irony worth savoring. The Greeks, who gave us philosophy and logic, also gave us theater that reveled in the illogical pull of desire. They seemed to understand that human beings can't live on reason alone. They need laughter, catharsis, the thrill of watching someone else stumble through the mess of passion. And perhaps that's why their performances still resonate. Strip away the masks, the togas, the ancient choruses, and you're left with the same truths we recognize today, that we are drawn to stories of love, lust, folly, and longing because they mirror our own. By the time the amphitheater emptied and the sun dipped behind the hills, the echoes of song and laughter lingered in the air. People carried them home like embers, small sparks that rekindled desire in kitchens, bedrooms, and whispered conversation. Performance had done what it was meant to do. It had stirred, unsettled, and enticed, leaving everyone eager for the next time the stage came alive under Dionysus's gaze. Because once you've been moved by words, rhythm, and bodies in motion, ordinary silence feels unbearably thin. In ancient Greece, religion and sex were not strange bedfellows. They were partners in the same dance. The gods themselves provided the blueprint, their myths overflowing with desire, jealousy, and transgression. Mortals looked at these divine dramas not as cautionary tales, but as validations of their own impulses. When Zeus disguised himself as a swan to seduce Leda, or when Aphrodite tangled mortals in webs of love and betrayal, people didn't clutch their pearls. They nodded knowingly, amused, perhaps even inspired. If the gods themselves were driven by irresistible passions, why should humans feel shame? It was a culture where myth functioned as both entertainment and permission slip. The stories were outrageous by design. Take Zeus, king of the gods, who spent as much time seducing mortals as he did ruling Olympus. His escapades included turning into a bull, a shower of gold, even an eagle, all to pursue desire. Imagine explaining that to your partner. Don't worry, dear, it wasn't me. It was a divine being disguised as precipitation. And yet, these myths weren't dismissed as nonsense. They carried weight, shaping how people thought about power, love, and the dangerous thrill of crossing boundaries. Lust was not a shameful detour. It was part of the divine order. Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, embodied another side of this truth. Her very existence was tied to desire. Born from sea foam, she represented both irresistible attraction and destructive obsession. Worship of Aphrodite often included rituals drenched in sensuality, from offerings of perfume and flowers to the presence of sacred courtesans in her temples. To pray to her was to acknowledge that beauty could unmake kingdoms and drive people to madness, but also to admit that without it, life would be unbearably flat. The Greeks never pretended that desire was tidy. They accepted that it was both honey and venom, blessing and curse. Even darker myths reinforced this worldview. The tale of Phaedra, consumed with forbidden love for her stepson, or of Medea, whose passion turned to vengeance, reminded audiences that desire could unravel families and nations. These stories didn't discourage passion. They showed its inevitability. Like a river bursting its banks, it might flood, destroy, and leave scars. But it was also the very force that watered the fields of life. To live without desire, the myths suggested, was to live without vitality. What's fascinating is how openly these myths were retold, painted, and performed. Pottery shards show images of erotic encounters between gods and mortals, not hidden away but used in daily life. Cups, plates, vases. Picture drinking your morning wine from a cup painted with Zeus, seducing yet another mortal. It was a reminder, cheeky and profound, that the divine was never far from the intimate. In our world, we decorate mugs with inspirational quotes. The Greeks decorated theirs with orgiastic gods. It says a lot about what they considered essential to remember over breakfast. The myths also shaped expectations and rituals. Fertility festivals reenacted divine unions, sometimes with symbolic gestures, sometimes with shocking literalism. Participants believed that by mimicking the gods, they drew divine power into their own lives. If Aphrodite could inspire Paris to abandon duty for love, surely she could make a marriage bed fertile. If Dionysus could tear down boundaries with wine and ecstasy, surely he could loosen the soil for planting. To imitate the gods was not blasphemy. It was survival. What lingers most is how myth gave people a language for their own contradictions. They could laugh at Aristophanes' bawdy jokes about lust, then weep with Aeschylus' tragic lovers, all while seeing their own struggles mirrored in divine form. The gods were not role models in the modern sense. They were mirrors. In them, people saw their desires magnified to cosmic scale. It was comforting, in a strange way, to know that if your heart was in chaos, so was Olympus, and perhaps that's why these stories endure. Even now, we recognize ourselves in Zeus's unrestrained hunger, in Aphrodite's intoxicating allure, in Phaedra's forbidden longing. They remind us that desire, whether comic or catastrophic, is part of what makes us human. The Greeks refused to sanitize it, to hide it in shadows. They told it openly, painted it boldly, performed it without shame. And in doing so, they left us with a question that still stirs unease today. What if the most divine thing about us is not our restraint, but our inability to resist? In the Greek world, religion was not confined to solemn temples and official ceremonies. It spilled into streets, into wild hillsides, into midnight processions where people shed their ordinary lives and surrendered to something primal. The festivals of fertility, especially those linked to Dionysus and Demeter, carried within them a current of desire that was as much about survival as it was about pleasure. To modern eyes, they might look like drunken revelries or carnivals of excess. But for the Greeks, they were crucial acts of renewal, ensuring that fields would bear crops, animals would breed, and humans themselves would continue the cycle of life. Desire was not decoration in these festivals. It was the central ingredient. During Dionysian celebrations, men and women left behind their rigid roles, and allowed themselves to dissolve into the crowd. They donned masks, beat drums, danced until their feet bled, and drank wine that blurred the boundaries between self and other. In those moments, intimacy was no longer about individuals, but about communities carried away by a shared frenzy. Imagine a village that spends its days under strict social codes, suddenly erupting into collective ecstasy, where strangers embraced and rules evaporated. It was chaotic, unsettling, sometimes scandalous, but it was also cathartic. People needed that release, a reminder that beneath the layers of law and reason, they were still animals guided by hunger, laughter, and longing. These festivals often included symbols that left little to the imagination. Processions carried giant phallic statues through the streets, decorated with garlands, as crowds sang songs laced with innuendo. Children laughed, elders nodded, and no one pretended they didn't know what it meant. Desire was paraded openly, acknowledged as the raw force that kept the world alive. It's hard not to smile at the honesty of it. While later cultures would hide sexuality behind closed doors, the Greeks wheeled it through the marketplace on a cart, shouting jokes along the way. And perhaps they were healthier for it, recognizing that pretending desire doesn't exist never makes it disappear. It only drives it into darker corners. The rituals tied to Demeter carried a different energy, but the undertone was the same. The Eleusinian mysteries, secretive rites dedicated to the goddess of grain, were shrouded in silence. Yet accounts suggest that themes of fertility, rebirth, and union pulsed through the ceremonies. Initiates experienced something so powerful they were forbidden to speak of it, but they left convinced that life and death themselves were bound together in a cosmic cycle. The language of grain sprouting from soil was inseparable from the language of desire, the seed planted, the earth receiving, life bursting forth. For the Greeks, the act of sowing was both agricultural and erotic, reminding them that the rhythms of the field mirrored the rhythms of the body. What made these festivals unforgettable was the way they broke barriers. Gender roles shifted, hierarchies blurred, and even slaves were sometimes permitted to join the revelry. For a brief span, the rigid lines of society bent, and people could step into roles forbidden to them in daily life. A man in a mask could dance like a satyr, a woman could sing verses that mocked authority, a farmer could pretend to be a king. That, in the landscape of Greek ritual, there was always a fascination with the body, not just as flesh, but as symbol, as a vessel through which cosmic truths were revealed. Certain cults, especially those with roots in fertility and mystery rites, wove sexuality into their fabric with a daring frankness. They believed that by staging desire, by embodying it publicly or in secret enclaves, they could tap into a power greater than themselves. To us, this sounds either exhilarating or scandalous, probably both, but to them, it was necessity. Without these reenactments of union, how could the cycles of nature be sustained? How could fields, wombs, and even the state remain fertile? Take, for example, the cult of Dionysus, where processions wound through the streets with ecstatic worshippers carrying thirsoi, staffs crowned with ivy and sometimes topped with pine cones that were not so subtle fertility symbols. They chanted, they danced wildly, and often their movements carried unmistakably erotic undertones. Women, the Maenads, were said to leave their homes, abandoning the strict domestic roles imposed on them, to join in frenzied celebrations on mountainsides. The line between religious ecstasy and sexual liberation blurred, as if the two were merely faces of the same coin. And perhaps that was the point. Desire unshackled the soul, and in its freedom, one could taste the divine. In contrast, other cults cloaked their erotic elements in secrecy. The Eleusinian mysteries, celebrated in honor of Demeter and Persephone, were famed for their hidden rites. While the precise details remain obscure, ancient sources hint at rituals where fertility was dramatized through symbolic acts of union. Participants were sworn to silence, but the secrecy itself heightened the allure. To be part of something forbidden, whispered about but never fully revealed, gave the participants a sense of intimacy not just with each other, but with the divine. There's something deliciously human about that, the knowledge that half the thrill comes from not being allowed to talk about it afterward. The Greeks, pragmatic as always, folded humor into even the most serious rituals. Consider the cult of Priapus, a rustic fertility god whose shrines displayed statues with comically exaggerated features. Farmers would offer prayers and sacrifices at these shrines, not with solemn hymns, but with a wink and a laugh. A god of gardens and fertility embodied with such bawdy imagery reminds us that, for the Greeks, desire was not something to be hidden away in shame. It was as natural as planting seeds in spring, and just as funny when things went wrong. If your crops failed, was it because you forgot to honor Priapus, or because the gods just had a wicked sense of humor that year? Even in civic life, these cults spilled over into festivals where erotic symbolism was impossible to miss. During the Anthesteria, a festival of Dionysus, wine flowed freely and participants wore masks, indulging in role reversal and playful promiscuity. Husbands would symbolically offer their wives to Dionysus in ritual marriages, blurring the line between metaphor and enactment. Was this literal? Maybe not. Was it suggestive enough to keep everyone guessing? Absolutely. And that's the brilliance of Greek ritual. It thrived on ambiguity, creating spaces where the sacred and the sensual overlapped so fully that no one dared or wanted to separate them. What made these rituals enduring was the sense that they reflected truths too complex for straightforward rules. By dramatizing desire, by letting it run wild in controlled settings, societies released pressure valves that might otherwise explode. It's not so different from modern carnivals or festivals where people dress up, drink more than they should, and allow themselves to act in ways they'd never attempt in daily life. Humans seem to need those moments when propriety collapses and instincts rule, if only to reset the balance afterward. The Greeks simply wove theirs into the fabric of religion, giving divine sanction to what everyone secretly craved. And within all this chaos, something profound lingered. Beneath the laughter at Priapus statues, beneath the intoxicated dances of Dionysian worshippers, beneath the hushed secrecy of mystery rites, there was a recognition that desire was not an enemy of spirituality, but one of its engines. To embrace longing, to acknowledge the body's pull, was to acknowledge life itself. The Greeks didn't always get it right. Sometimes the chaos spilled too far, but they understood better than most that denying desire entirely was denying humanity. And perhaps that's why their rituals still capture our imagination, because they force us to ask whether our own ways of compartmentalizing love, sex, and faith are truly as enlightened as we like to think. In ancient Greece, the gymnasium was far more than a place for physical training. It was a stage where bodies became spectacles, where beauty was displayed and admired openly, and where the lines between athleticism, philosophy, and desire were thinner than the dust coating the wrestler's skin. Men trained naked, their movements both practical and erotic, their sweat not only proof of exertion, but also a symbol of vitality. To walk through a gymnasium was to wander into a space where discipline and temptation mingled so naturally that no one felt the need to separate them. The Greeks valued the male form not just as a biological reality, but as an aesthetic and spiritual ideal. Muscles flexed in wrestling matches were echoes of gods sculpted in marble, living reminders of Apollo's grace or Heracles' strength. Admiration was not hidden, it was expected. Teachers, philosophers, and spectators found themselves drawn to the sight of youthful athletes, not in whispered secrecy, but in conversations and poems that celebrated the beauty of bodies in motion. For the Greeks, desire wasn't an embarrassing byproduct of physical training. It was proof that the divine could be glimpsed in human form. Wrestling was especially charged. Two men, bodies oiled and glistening, locked in combat, straining against one another in a dance that was equal parts struggle and embrace. The crowd cheered their skill, but the spectacle carried a second layer that no one pretended not to notice. It was both sport and display, competition and invitation. The body became an argument, a silent declaration that strength and beauty could inspire longing as easily as admiration. And the fact that this was done in public spaces speaks volumes about how the Greeks understood intimacy, not as something confined to shadows, but as something that could stand in the sunlight without shame. Philosophy found its place here too. Socrates, Plato, and their successors often sought out gymnasia, not just to exercise, but to converse. Discussions of virtue, justice, and love unfolded in the same air, thick with the scent of oil and sweat. Imagine debating the immortality of the soul while someone is grappling half-naked a few feet away. It takes a special kind of focus. But perhaps the Greeks saw no contradiction. For them, the pursuit of wisdom and the pursuit of beauty were part of the same path. Eros, the god of desire, was not excluded from philosophy. He was invited into the debate as a necessary companion. And it wasn't only men who shaped these rituals of desire. Courtesans and musicians often lingered near gymnasia, adding layers of charm to gatherings, blending performance with allure. Erotic poetry sometimes made its way into recitations, blurring the line between admiration of the mind and admiration of the body. What emerged was a culture where the erotic was neither hidden nor trivialized. It was an energy to be directed, discussed, and sometimes indulged. The Greeks believed that to acknowledge desire was to harness it, not to be undone by it. It's easy for us to laugh now at how boldly they placed desire at the center of civic life. Imagine a modern gym where people not only admired each other's physiques, but composed odes about them on the spot. Yet, in their laughter, the Greeks were onto something profound. They recognized that longing isn't an interruption of life's higher pursuits. It's woven into them. To admire beauty, to feel the quickening of pulse in its presence, was not weakness, but a reminder of vitality. And maybe the real question isn't whether they were too open about it, but whether we've become too closed. The legacy of those gymnasia lingers in the marble statues we still marvel at today. They are frozen echoes of a culture that dared to put desire on display, to admit that bodies and minds both deserved worship. And while time has dulled the dust and silenced the voices that once rang through those courtyards, the truth remains. The Greeks never tried to tame desire into silence. They let it breathe, they let it wrestle, they let it shine in the open air. reminding us that passion, when acknowledged, becomes less a danger and more a mirror showing us who we are. In Greek society, the symposium was more than an excuse to drink wine. It was a carefully staged ritual where conversation, performance, and desire collided in ways that revealed as much about human longing as about intellectual debate. Reclining on couches, guests shared not just cups of diluted wine, but also glances, jokes, and whispered compliments. The act of drinking together blurred social barriers, softened inhibitions, and opened the door to exchanges that would have been unthinkable in the bright harshness of daylight. The wine itself was a symbol of Dionysus's gift, an elixir that loosened tongues and, with them, the carefully constructed walls of propriety. The setting was charged with symbolism. Lamps glowed against polished pottery, and garlands of ivy or roses hung loosely around necks, wilting as the night stretched on. Courtesans, poets, and musicians drifted in and out, turning the room into a stage where everyone was both spectator and actor. Even the simple act of passing a cup carried a layer of intimacy. Hands brushing, eyes meeting over the rim, as though the wine itself was conspiring to create connections. Games like Korobos, where men flicked dregs of wine at targets while making playful wagers, turned drinking into flirtation cloaked in sport. It's proof that the human impulse to turn drinking games into opportunities for innuendo is at least 2,000 years old. What made the symposium unique was how openly it mingled intellectual and erotic desire. One moment, a guest might deliver a serious speech about the immortality of the soul. The next, he'd be leaning closer to admire the curve of a fellow guest's shoulder. Plato's symposium immortalized this blend, turning a night of drinking into one of the most famous philosophical explorations of love. But let's be honest, while Socrates was debating the nature of true beauty, there were probably a few participants hoping beauty would wander over and recline beside them. Ideas and bodies mingled effortlessly, and the Greeks didn't pretend otherwise. Poetry was the heartbeat of these gatherings. Verses of Sappho, with their aching tenderness, or Anacreon's playful songs about wine and love, were recited to stir not only the mind but the heart. A well-timed line of poetry could function as both seduction and confession, slipping desire into the open without naming it too directly. In this way, words became caresses, and the symposium became a ritual where language itself was erotic. Even silence carried weight. The pause after verse is charged as the moment before a kiss. The role of courtesans added another dimension. Known for their wit and refinement, they were not simply objects of desire, but participants in the games of intellect and charm. They could out-joke, out-sing, or out-think their companions, and in doing so, they blurred the boundaries between performance and intimacy. Desire here was not one-directional. It was an exchange, a dance of wit and attraction. And perhaps this is why the symposium endured as a cultural touchstone. It elevated flirtation into an art form, turning every interaction into part of a larger drama. Laughter filled the air as much as music or philosophy. Crude jokes, outrageous stories, and playful insults cut through the solemnity, reminding everyone that the night was meant to be lived as much as it was meant to be remembered. If tragedy showed the dangers of passion, the symposium embraced its joys. To laugh at lust, to mock one's own vulnerability in love, was a way of acknowledging its inevitability. After all, desire is easier to bear when it's shared with a room full of companions who are equally intoxicated by wine and possibility. As the night wore on, the symposium blurred into something less structured, more primal. Guests slipped into corners, words slurred into songs, and the carefully arranged couches became stages for softer, quieter encounters. What began as ritual often ended in chaos, but chaos was part of the charm. The Greeks accepted that ecstasy and disorder were close siblings, both born from loosening the grip of reason. And in that acceptance lay their genius. They didn't demand that desire be neat or predictable. They allowed it to be messy, intoxicating, and profoundly human. By dawn, the garlands had withered, the lamps burned low, and the floor was sticky with wine. Yet participants carried away something more lasting than a hangover. They left with the memory of having touched, if only briefly, a world where conversation and seduction were the same language, where laughter and philosophy shared the same couch, and where desire was not a shameful secret, but the pulse of life itself. And as they stepped back into the sunlit order of their daily lives, they carried with them the echo of songs, the aftertaste of wine, and the lingering question of whether the truest form of communion happens not in temples, but in the simple act of reclining beside another, sharing words and warmth until night dissolves into morning. The rituals of ancient Greece often carried a paradox. They were both deeply spiritual and unapologetically sensual. Few practices embodied this tension more than the ceremonies dedicated to fertility, where the human body was not treated as something shameful, but as a vessel through which divine forces expressed themselves. These rites were not whispered about in corners. They were celebrated in fields, temples, and even city squares, reminding everyone that survival itself depended on acknowledging desire. Grain would not grow, children would not be born, and herds would not thrive without honoring the unseen powers tied to sex and procreation. For the Greeks, ignoring this reality was not just foolish, it was dangerous. In many festivals, men and women performed symbolic acts of union that mirrored the cycles of nature. Seeds were cast into the soil with prayers that spoke openly of the marriage between earth and sky. Plowing, which today sounds like the dullest of chores, was dramatized as a sacred act of penetration, meant to remind everyone that farming itself was an erotic gesture. The land was a mother, the rains were lovers, and every harvest was born from that cosmic intimacy. It may sound exaggerated, but if you've ever planted something and watched it grow, you know how much like magic it feels. Maybe even a little scandalous when you think about how literal the Greeks made it. Some rituals went even further, with explicit processions of phallic symbols carried through villages. These were not hidden away but paraded proudly, often decorated with flowers and ribbons, cheered on by the community. It's almost comical to imagine. Farmers laughing, children chasing after the parade, grandmothers nodding approvingly, all while an enormous wooden phallus was marched through the streets. To us, it might seem absurd or even indecent, but for them, it was reverence disguised as comedy. Humor softened the seriousness, making everyone comfortable enough to celebrate truths that, when spoken to directly, might feel overwhelming. The role of women in these rites was equally important, if not central. In festivals like the Thesmophoria, women gathered apart from men to perform secret rituals in honor of Demeter and Persephone. These involved symbolic offerings, acts of fasting, and rituals that hinted at fertility's raw power. Men were excluded, which both intrigued and unsettled them, creating a mystique around female-only ceremonies. What exactly went on remains partly unknown, but fragments suggest a mix of solemn devotion and earthy humor. A reminder that women understood fertility not only as divine mystery, but as the daily reality they carried in their own bodies. It's easy to imagine the laughter of these gatherings, jokes about husbands, the struggles of childbirth, the frustrations of desire, woven alongside prayers for abundance. Music and dance amplified the energy of these celebrations. Flutes played notes that seemed to spiral upward like smoke, while drums pounded rhythms that mirrored the heartbeat. Dancers swayed in circles, their movements often symbolic of the cycles of life, death, and rebirth. The body, moving freely in time with the music, became both instrument and offering. There was no separation between art and devotion, no divide between entertainment and prayer. The Greeks knew that rhythm could bypass the mind and speak directly to the body, and in that communication lay the closest thing to divine possession. The presence of laughter in these rituals cannot be overstated. Just as in the cult of Priapus, where statues with exaggerated features became both objects of worship and comedy, fertility celebrations embraced the ridiculous as much as the sacred. It was their way of balancing the enormity of desire with the relief of humor. After all, how else do you deal with the terrifying fact that without sex, without fertility, everything stops? You laugh, you joke, you make it light enough to carry. And in that laughter, the Greeks found a way to honor life without being crushed by its weight. As dawn followed nights of music, dance, and offerings, participants often left these ceremonies with more than just blessings for fertile fields. They carried the reminder that their own lives were tied to forces beyond their control, that desire was not an enemy to suppress, but a rhythm to follow. They left, knowing that the laughter they shared, the symbols they carried, the dances they performed, were all threads in a larger fabric where the human and the divine touched. And perhaps that was the most enduring gift of these rituals, the sense that in celebrating fertility openly, they were not just ensuring crops or children, but acknowledging the pulse of existence itself. And when the celebrations ended and people returned to their daily routines, tending vines, weaving cloth, raising families, the echoes of those nights lingered. The jokes, the songs, the dances, and even the sight of a decorated phallus carried through the village were reminders that life, for all its hardships, was also playful, sensual, and endlessly renewing. In that balance of humor and reverence, of desire and discipline, the Greeks revealed a wisdom that still unsettles and fascinates us today, that the sacred does not hide from the sensual, it thrives through it. The Greeks had a way of binding sex, ritual, and community into one seamless experience, and nowhere was this clearer than in the festivals that blurred the line between performance and participation. These events were not simply spectacles to be observed. They demanded the body, the voice, and the spirit of every participant. The streets themselves became stages, temples became theaters, and citizens became actors in dramas that were at once sacred and scandalous. To enter these spaces was to step into a world where laughter mixed with prayer, where the erotic was no less divine than the hymn sung at dawn. One of the most striking aspects was how everyday objects were transformed into symbols of desire. Wine jars painted with erotic scenes were not hidden curiosities, they were passed hand to hand at banquets. Torches carried in night processions glowed with more than fire. They represented the spark of passion that bound communities together. Even bread and fruit, those most ordinary of foods, could become offerings charged with erotic meaning. A pomegranate was never just a pomegranate. It was Persephone's forbidden bite, an invitation to think about fertility and death in the same mouthful. Imagine biting into your lunch and being reminded that you, too, are part of a cosmic love affair. That's how the Greeks lived their daily rituals. Theatrical performances also carried this erotic undercurrent. Comedy, especially, was filled with exaggerated sexual imagery that made audiences roar with laughter even as it slipped in sharp commentary about politics and society. A character parading on stage with an oversized prop left no ambiguity about the message, yet it wasn't mindless humor. It was a reminder that sexuality was not separate from civic life. To joke about desire in public was to acknowledge its presence everywhere, from the bedroom to the voting assembly. And isn't that still true today? Our jokes about relationships, dating apps, or midlife crises are often how we admit truths we're too shy to say outright. Music deepened the effect. Flutes played in high-pitched, intoxicating tones that mimicked sighs, while drums hammered out rhythms that seemed to match the body's own pulse. These sounds bypassed reason, inviting listeners to move, sway, and sometimes lose themselves in collective dances that bordered on frenzy. In these moments, individuality dissolved. The young, the old, the wealthy, the poor, all were caught in the same rhythm, as if the gods were using music to remind mortals that desire was the great equalizer. After all, it doesn't matter if you're a philosopher or a farmer. When the flute hits the right note, your heart skips the same beat. What fascinates most is how seriously they took play. To the Greeks, laughter and games were not diversions from worship, but essential parts of it. Sacred parades often featured playful insults shouted between participants, a ritualized teasing that broke down hierarchy and let people share in the vulnerability of being mocked. Even priests and officials weren't spared. The divine demanded humility, and sometimes the best way to achieve it was through the sting of a well-aimed joke. In a world where desire could be overwhelming, humor kept it from becoming unbearable. You could pray with tears in your eyes one moment and laugh so hard your stomach hurt the next, and both were equally sacred. There was also an intimacy in the way these rituals acknowledged the inevitability of imperfection. Not every performance was polished, not every dance graceful. Someone always stumbled, missed a line, or drank too much wine before their turn to sing. Instead of being condemned, these mistakes became part of the charm. It was as though the Greeks were saying, passion itself is messy, so why should our rituals pretend otherwise? Perfection belonged to the gods. Humanity's role was to celebrate the chaos of desire with honesty and laughter. As the celebrations stretched long into the night, people left not with the sense that they had completed a religious duty, but that they had shared in something profoundly human. They had eaten, drunk, laughed, danced, and perhaps even crossed boundaries of propriety. But in doing so, they had touched the divine, not in spite of their bodies, but through them. The echo of laughter lingered in the streets. The scent of wine and incense clung to their clothes, and the memory of glances exchanged under torchlight stayed long after the fire was gone. It was these aftertastes, the little reminders of being fully alive, that made the rituals endure across generations. And maybe that's the deepest insight the Greeks leave us with, that we spend so much of our lives trying to separate what is serious from what is playful, what is holy from what is physical, what is respectable from what is ridiculous. They refused those divisions. They knew that the most sacred truths often arrive disguised as jokes, that desire often reveals itself in accidents, and that the divine is as present in a burst of laughter as it is in the most solemn prayer. It is a lesson that still unsettles us today, precisely because it feels both liberating and uncomfortable. And that tension, that refusal to divide what we secretly know is inseparable, keeps us listening for the next revelation hidden in their rituals. In ancient Greece, the human body was not just a shell to be clothed and fed. It was a canvas, a symbol, and sometimes even a weapon of ritual. The Greeks cultivated a relationship with their bodies that was deeply intertwined with the divine, so much so that practices we might view as everyday grooming or performance were imbued with erotic and spiritual significance. Take the simple act of anointing oneself with oil before entering the gymnasium. To us, it might look like vanity, but to them, it was both preparation for athleticism and a kind of ritualized seduction. The gleam of oiled skin caught the light, accentuated curves and muscles, and made the act of exercise into something closer to theater. And if you've ever noticed how modern gyms are filled with mirrors, you know this instinct has hardly disappeared. We just replaced amphorae of olive oil with protein shakes and Instagram selfies. But the body was not only celebrated in motion, it was also staged in ritual performances that blurred the line between religious devotion and erotic display. Certain festivals featured dances where men and women shed layers of clothing as they moved, their gestures mimicking fertility and union. These weren't cheap spectacles. They were statements, affirmations that desire itself was a divine force. The gods demanded to be honored not with sterile rituals, but with living, breathing proof that their creations pulsed with life. In a world where fertility determined survival, the dramatization of desire was not optional. It was survival strategy disguised as celebration. Even theater itself was inseparable from this current of sensuality. Greek comedies were notorious for their outrageous use of sexual imagery. Actors paraded with exaggerated costumes that left no room for subtlety, making audiences howl with laughter, while also forcing them to confront the raw realities of appetite and reproduction. Imagine sitting in an open-air theater, the scent of wine lingering from the pre-show feast, when suddenly a character appears on stage with a costume designed solely to remind everyone that lust is universal. It was both embarrassing and liberating, a chance to laugh at the very instincts that ruled human life. And perhaps that laughter was the point. The Greeks knew that mocking desire was just another way of admitting how much it controlled them. Outside the theater, the streets carried their own performances. Processions filled with symbols that today would be censored or laughed at were paraded with pride and reverence. Phallic statues, fertility idols, and even humorous effigies turned entire communities into audiences of erotic symbolism. Children laughed, elders nodded knowingly, and farmers prayed for fertile soil. It's almost comical to picture, but it speaks to how deeply the Greeks accepted that sexuality was not some hidden corner of existence, but the foundation of life itself. We like to think we've progressed, but our advertising still does the same thing, except instead of priests carrying wooden phalluses, we have billboards with half-naked models selling perfume. Different props, same theater. Philosophy, too, couldn't avoid this entanglement. Thinkers like Plato used erotic desire as a metaphor for the soul's longing for truth. Love wasn't only about flesh. It was about the hunger for beauty, the spark that drove humans toward greatness. But in the same dialogues, where the loftiest ideas about eternity were debated, there was an undeniable acknowledgement of attraction between teacher and student, mentor and pupil. Desire for the Greeks was not merely a distraction from philosophy, it was its ignition. Without longing, without attraction, why would anyone reach for something beyond themselves? And in that sense, Eros became the quiet co-author of philosophy itself. What's fascinating is how humor constantly softened these edges. When rituals risked becoming too intense, comedy stepped in, reminding everyone that no matter how sacred the act, it was still performed by mortals who tripped, stammered, or drank too much. Think of a solemn festival suddenly punctured by someone missing a dance step and sending the crowd into laughter. Instead of breaking the ritual, it made it more real, more human. The Greeks seemed to understand that laughter is one of the best ways to carry the weight of passion without being crushed by it. If you've ever laughed during a moment that was supposed to be serious, you know how strangely sacred that relief can feel. As these rituals unfolded across fields, theaters, and temples, they created a culture that embraced the messy contradictions of human life. Desire was holy and hilarious, terrifying and liberating, dangerous and necessary. The Greeks did not seek to tidy it away into neat categories. They let it spill into every corner of existence. And that openness created a legacy that still unsettles us. We live in societies that endlessly debate what is appropriate, what is obscene, what is sacred. The Greeks would probably laugh at our rules, pour another cup of wine, and remind us that life itself is obscene and sacred all at once. By the time the lamps burned out and the garlands of ivy had withered, participants in these rituals carried home more than just the memory of spectacle. They carried the weight of having touched truths too vast for words, truth that laughter and desire expressed better than silence ever could. And perhaps the most lasting impression was the realization that in celebrating their bodies and their appetites without shame, they were closer to the gods than they ever could be through restraint alone. It was messy, it was wild, it was sometimes ridiculous, but it was real. And that reality, unfiltered and raw, is what kept people coming back year after year, ready to laugh, ready to dance, and ready to surrender once more to the divine pull of desire. In the twilight of Greek ritual life, the mysteries began to unfold in ways that still puzzle historians today. The Eleusinian mysteries, perhaps the most famous of all, were shrouded in secrecy so thick that even whispers of what truly happened could only be guessed through fragments. What we do know is tantalizing. People from all walks of life, citizens, foreigners, even slaves, were invited to participate, provided they spoke Greek and had never committed murder. That detail alone is telling. These ceremonies weren't designed for elites to lord over others, but for anyone who was willing to step into the darkness and embrace a shared vulnerability. Imagine thousands of people gathered in torchlight, entering a sacred hall where the usual lines of class and status dissolved into shadows and smoke. At the heart of these rituals was the myth of Demeter and Persephone, a story of loss, rebirth, and the terrifying power of desire. Persephone's abduction by Hades, her consumption of the pomegranate seeds, and Demeter's grief-stricken wandering across the earth formed the foundation of rites that promised participants a glimpse into the cycle of life and death. But these myths were not told in hushed monotones. They were enacted, felt, and embodied. Torches blazed in the night to mimic Demeter's search. Chants echoed like cries of mourning, and feasts celebrated her reunion with her daughter. This wasn't just storytelling, it was immersive theater with cosmic stakes. And maybe that's why people risked secrecy and punishment just to attend, because in those nights they weren't just listeners, they were part of the myth itself. The role of initiation was critical. Participants began with fasting and purification, stripping themselves of ordinary indulgences before being plunged into ritual performances that likely included sacred objects, secret words, and dramatic reenactments. The goal wasn't just entertainment, but transformation. To be initiated was to carry away not just knowledge, but an experience so visceral that it promised hope even in the face of death. Think about that. In a world without modern medicine, where plagues could wipe out families overnight and war always loomed, a ritual that whispered, "Death is not the end," was worth more than gold. But it wasn't all solemn. Like many Greek rituals, humor played its part. The story of Iambe, who allegedly lifted her skirt and cracked crude jokes to make Demeter laugh in her grief, reminds us that even in the face of despair, laughter was sacred. This moment wasn't a sideshow. It was written into the very fabric of the mysteries, proof that comedy itself could heal, that laughter was as divine as lament. Isn't it strange that today we separate religion and humor so rigidly, when the Greeks knew you sometimes need a joke more than a sermon? Imagine mourning a loss and having someone tell the most inappropriate joke possible, and somehow, against your will, you laugh. That's the space the Greeks saw as holy. The power of the Eleusinian mysteries also lay in their secrecy. Initiates were forbidden to reveal what they saw, under penalty of death, and yet the rituals thrived for centuries. That silence created an aura of intrigue, making the rites both exclusive and magnetic. People didn't need to know the details to crave the experience. The mystery was the allure. Perhaps this is a lesson in itself. Sometimes what is left unsaid holds more power than what is shouted from rooftops. In a world drowning in oversharing, the idea of carrying a secret so profound that it binds you to a community for life feels almost revolutionary. Archaeologists have found remnants, temples, inscriptions, vessels that hint at the grandeur of these ceremonies, but the essence eludes us. And maybe it should, because the true power of ritual lies not in reconstructing the script, but in understanding what it did to those who lived it. The mysteries gave people permission to believe that life was part of a cycle too vast to grasp, that desire and death were intertwined forces guiding humanity toward renewal. They reminded participants that the human body, with all its hunger and fragility, was still capable of touching the divine. When dawn broke after nights of fasting, laughter, and revelation, initiates returned to their daily lives changed. They carried within them the unspoken memory of something beyond ordinary reality. Fields had to be plowed, families tended, debts paid, but all of it was seen through a new lens. Life had meaning because they had walked in darkness, heard sacred words, and emerged with light. They had felt the embrace of myth not as story but as truth lived in their own bones. And perhaps that's the point. The Greeks didn't use rituals to escape the messiness of life, but to dive deeper into it. They laughed, cried, drank, fasted, stumbled, and sang their way to insights that still resonate. To us, their practices may seem strange, but if we strip away the costumes and torches, what remains is strikingly familiar. The longing to understand where we came from, what binds us together, and whether death really has the last word. That longing has never left us. It just wears new clothes. And the Greeks, with their mysteries, left behind a reminder that sometimes the most profound truths cannot be explained. They can only be experienced. The Greeks carried an extraordinary belief that desire was not merely a fleeting impulse, but a force that could bridge the gap between mortals and gods. Nowhere was this clearer than in the cults dedicated to Aphrodite, where love, lust, and devotion were wrapped together in rituals that blurred the line between prayer and pleasure. To enter her temples was not simply to light incense or whisper a prayer. It was to step into a space where longing itself became sacred currency. Devotees did not hide their desires as shameful. They offered them up as gifts, trusting that the goddess who embodied beauty and attraction would transform private hunger into divine connection. In cities like Corinth, temples dedicated to Aphrodite became infamous, even scandalous, for what outsiders interpreted as sacred prostitution. Hundreds of priestesses are said to have served not only as attendants of the goddess, but as embodiments of her. Visitors, merchants, and citizens might have found themselves participating in acts of intimacy that were framed not as transactions, but as rituals of devotion. Imagine someone today saying they went to church and left with both spiritual enlightenment and a story they couldn't tell their in-laws. It gives new meaning to the phrase religious experience. The blending of sacred duty and physical desire was less contradiction than affirmation. Love in all its forms, from the tender to the carnal, was a reflection of the divine. The offerings to Aphrodite were just as telling. Instead of the sterile sacrifices we often associate with temples, worshippers brought perfumes, mirrors, jewelry, and even tokens of passion. These gifts weren't about appeasing a stern god, they were about seducing a goddess, showing her that mortals, too, could participate in beauty. One could argue that Aphrodite was the original influencer, demanding tribute not of gold and cattle, but of luxury and charm. People didn't want her wrath, they wanted her favor, the shimmer of her presence in their lives, the assurance that their own desires were not burdens but blessings. Yet what makes these rituals fascinating is not just their sensuality, but their inclusivity. Unlike other cults restricted by class or gender, the worship of Aphrodite welcomed a wide array of participants. Men and women, young and old, wealthy elites and poor laborers, all found common ground in the acknowledgement of longing. Desire, after all, doesn't ask for your bank account or your family name. It seizes you without warning. In that way, the temple was a rare democratic space where human vulnerability was not hidden but elevated, and maybe that's what made these rituals feel so liberating. They stripped away pretense and reminded people that no matter how powerful or powerless they were in daily life, they were equal in the face of longing. Music and dance often accompanied these ceremonies, adding layers of energy that transformed worship into celebration. The rhythms of flutes and drums carried participants into states where self-consciousness dissolved. Movement became prayer, touch became offering, and laughter, yes, laughter, was as sacred as tears. If you've ever been at a wedding where the dance floor suddenly erupts into chaos and everyone forgets their worries for a few minutes, you've tasted a fragment of what these rites must have felt like. It was a moment of suspension, a break from the everyday grind, where the ordinary was lifted into the extraordinary simply by letting bodies express what words could not. The philosophy of these practices carried profound implications. By making desire sacred, the Greeks effectively dismantled the notion that longing was a weakness. Instead, it became the pathway to transformation. To desire beauty was to move closer to divinity, to acknowledge that life's greatest joys were not hidden in denial, but in acceptance. The challenge wasn't to suppress hunger, but to understand it, to channel it toward connection, creativity, and renewal. It's almost ironic. In a world that often treated discipline as the highest virtue, the Greeks dared to say that sometimes surrender was the holiest act of all. Even so, there were risks. Desire unbridled could lead to obsession, jealousy, or ruin, and the Greeks knew this well. Myths are filled with cautionary tales of those who chased beauty too recklessly and paid the price. But the rituals of Aphrodite offered a controlled space for exploring these passions. By ritualizing intimacy, they gave desire boundaries, turning something chaotic into something communal. It was a reminder that while love could undo kingdoms, it could also build them. When dawn crept across the horizon and the fires in the temples dimmed, what lingered was not shame but a sense of renewal. Participants returned to their homes carrying the strange comfort of having touched something larger than themselves. Desire had been honored, laughter had been shared, and for a brief moment the walls between gods and mortals felt thin enough to see through. And perhaps that was the true genius of these rituals. They took something as ordinary as longing and revealed it to be extraordinary, a force that didn't just consume people but connected them, to each other, to their gods, and to life itself. The Greeks never imagined desire as something confined to private chambers. It spilled out into the streets, the fields, and the very fabric of their cities. Take the rural festivals known as Thesmophoria, where women gathered in the name of Demeter, goddess of fertility and the harvest. At first glance, it may sound like an agricultural ritual, complete with offerings and prayers for good crops. But beneath the surface, it was something much more provocative. Women retreating from daily life, bonding in spaces where fertility was celebrated through laughter, obscene jokes, and sometimes rituals so shocking that male poets wrote about them in whispers laced with both awe and fear. Imagine thousands of women gathering away from men for days at a time, throwing around humor that would make modern stand-up comedians blush, and you start to grasp the energy of these events. The power of the Thesmophoria lay in its exclusivity. Men were strictly forbidden from attending, which only heightened the aura of mystery. What went on inside these rituals? Ancient accounts suggest that women carried out mockery, role reversals, and perhaps even fertility magic involving the remains of sacrificed pigs buried months earlier. To an outsider, it might have looked like chaos. Women fasting, feasting, shouting obscene chants, and carrying strange objects through the fields. Yet within this chaos was purpose. These acts symbolized the cycles of decay and renewal that governed both agriculture and human reproduction. The rotting pigs weren't disgusting. They were reminders that life requires death, that fertility comes from the breakdown of what came before. It's the same principle that makes composting work, but with more singing, more wine, and considerably fewer gardening gloves. What's remarkable is how these rituals gave women a rare space of authority in a society largely dominated by men. For a few days, they held the power of fertility in their hands, quite literally, and the community depended on them to perform their rites properly. The laughter, the jokes, even the obscenities weren't signs of frivolity. They were tools of empowerment. They mocked the solemnity of male-controlled religion, showing that women had their own channels to the divine. In fact, Aristophanes' comedies often poked fun at the secrecy of these rituals. But his satire only revealed how much men were unsettled by what they couldn't control. Isn't it ironic that what scared them most wasn't violence or rebellion, but women laughing together in ways they weren't supposed to? The role of humor in these gatherings cannot be overstated. It wasn't simply entertainment, it was magic in itself. By making fun of desire, by exaggerating it, by turning it into comedy, the women transformed something often tied to shame into something powerful and communal. If you've ever been in a room where shared laughter made everyone feel closer, even without knowing each other well, you understand the dynamic. The Greeks knew that laughter was a kind of glue, binding bodies and spirits together, dissolving isolation in a way solemn rituals never could. In fact, some scholars believe that the bawdy jokes shouted during these rites weren't vulgarity but invocations, spells disguised as laughter to ensure fertility and abundance. Food and fasting also played critical roles. Women began the festival with restraint, purifying themselves by avoiding certain foods, but eventually indulged in banquets that symbolized the return of plenty. It was a physical enactment of the agricultural cycle. Hunger followed by nourishment, loss followed by renewal. To eat together after fasting wasn't just satisfying, it was a metaphor for hope. It's no wonder these rituals endured for centuries, shaping not just religious practice, but cultural imagination. Every bite carried the weight of cosmic significance. The imagery woven into these rites was startlingly direct. Objects associated with fertility, figs, pomegranates, even loaves of bread shaped into provocative forms, were paraded openly. What to us might seem shocking or inappropriate was, for them, a declaration of life's most basic truths. You could not separate food from sex, growth from decay, laughter from ritual. Everything was linked, and everything pointed back to the simple but profound fact that without fertility, of the land, of the body, of the community, nothing else mattered. When the festival ended and the women returned home, they carried with them not only the memory of laughter and indulgence, but the assurance that they had participated in keeping the cycle of life moving. Men might have ruled the courts and assemblies, but in these days of ritual, women held the keys to renewal. They had fasted, joked, eaten, and sung their way into alignment with forces greater than themselves. And in doing so, they demonstrated something timeless, that the power of fertility is not fragile, not hidden, but raw, messy, and sometimes hilarious. What lingers when we think about these rituals is the sense of balance they created. They weren't afraid of obscenity because they knew it was part of life. They didn't shy away from decay because they understood it was the foundation of growth. They embraced laughter even in the most solemn contexts because they saw it as divine. And perhaps that's why these ancient practices still resonate with us today. They remind us that the sacred isn't always found in silence and solemnity. It's often hiding in the places we're told not to look, waiting to be revealed through a joke, a feast, or a celebration that refuses to separate the body from the soul. The Greeks treated love not as a private matter, but as a force powerful enough to shape politics, philosophy, and even the military. Nowhere is this clearer than in this strange and fascinating institution known as the Sacred Band of Thebes, a military unit made entirely of male lovers. Imagine it, 300 soldiers, 150 couples, bound not just by duty but by passion, fighting shoulder to shoulder with the person they loved most in the world. It wasn't just strategy, it was genius. The Greeks believed that no one would fight more fiercely than someone defending their beloved, and history seems to back them up. The Sacred Band held their ground against Sparta, the toughest military force of their time, proving that desire could be as effective a weapon as any spear. What makes this fascinating isn't just the military success, but the way it rewrote the rules of intimacy. In most societies, armies are built on hierarchy and discipline, but the Thebans dared to make theirs about affection and trust. Lovers trained together, ate together, and marched together. Their bond was more than comradeship. It was a fusion of romance and duty that blurred the line between battlefield and bedroom. Of course, to modern minds, this might sound like the plot of a controversial film, but to the Greeks, it was natural. They saw no contradiction between eros and heroism, between kisses and combat. One might even argue they invented the original power couple, though theirs wielded swords instead of matching outfits. The very existence of the Sacred Band tells us a lot about how the Greeks viewed desire. For them, erotic bonds between men were not seen as weaknesses, but as strengths that cultivated loyalty and courage. Plato himself mused about the idea that an army of lovers would be unbeatable because no one would dare shame themselves in front of the person whose admiration mattered most. And while philosophers often drifted into lofty abstractions about love, here was a case where theory marched directly into reality. It was as if Greek society collectively said, "Fine, let's test the idea in battle," and discovered it actually worked. But as inspiring as this is, it also carries a shadow. The story of the Sacred Band ends tragically at the Battle of Chaeronea, where they were annihilated by the forces of Philip II of Macedon, father of Alexander the Great. According to ancient accounts, when Philip walked through the battlefield and saw the bodies of lovers lying side by side, he was struck by awe rather than scorn. He supposedly declared that there was no greater proof of bravery than men who died defending their partners. The image is haunting. Rows of bodies intertwined, love and death fused in a final embrace. It reminds us that while passion can fuel greatness, it can also demand the ultimate sacrifice. The implications of this story ripple beyond military history. It forces us to rethink how relationships shape societies. The Greeks were not embarrassed to weave desire into their institutions, whereas modern culture often tries to separate the personal from the professional, the erotic from the civic. And yet, the bonds we form always influence the work we do, whether we admit it or not. The Sacred Band simply acknowledged this truth openly, daring to make love the foundation of their most dangerous endeavor. It's both revolutionary and oddly practical. After all, who wouldn't want their fiercest protector to be the person who knows them most intimately? In a way, the Sacred Band also highlights the fragility of human achievements. For decades, they stood as a symbol of strength feared and respected across Greece, but all it took was one crushing defeat for their legacy to shift from living power to legend. And yet, their memory survived precisely because it was extraordinary. Ordinary armies fade into obscurity, but an army of lovers? That becomes a story told for millennia. Perhaps that is the real victory. They may have lost the battle, but their defiance against conventional norms ensured they would never be forgotten. It's worth pausing to consider how this resonates today. We live in societies that still struggle with the idea of love between equals, that still debate who gets to love whom, and under what circumstances. And yet, in the 4th century BCE, an entire city-state built its elite army on that very principle. The irony is sharp. We think of the past as more repressed, but sometimes it was more daring. Maybe the Greeks understood something we still wrestle with, that love is not a distraction from strength, but one of its most powerful sources. And here's the thought that lingers. Perhaps the greatest rituals of desire weren't always performed in temples, shrouded in incense and hymns. Sometimes they played out on muddy battlefields, under banners and war cries, where devotion to a lover became indistinguishable from devotion to the gods. The Greeks, in their boldness, turned intimacy into strategy, laughter into magic, and longing into courage. And it leaves us wondering how many other hidden stories of desire are buried not in temples, but in the very fabric of history, waiting for us to rediscover them. In ancient Greece, desire was not only woven into festivals and battlefields, but also into the philosophical schools where men gathered to debate the meaning of life, justice, and truth. Yet these gatherings were not as sterile as the textbooks make them sound. In Plato's Symposium, for example, some of the greatest minds of the age are depicted not in dusty libraries, but reclining at a lavish drinking party, passing cups of wine and speaking about love while half inebriated. Imagine if today's academic conferences included togas, gallons of alcohol, and heartfelt speeches about romance. It might actually improve attendance. These occasions reveal how the Greeks saw no contradiction between intoxication, desire, and intellectual pursuit. For them, philosophy wasn't about removing passion, but understanding it, dissecting it, even celebrating it. Plato's dialogues describe love in forms both lofty and earthy. Socrates, for instance, argued that eros was not just about physical longing, but a ladder that could lead the soul upward, from lusting after bodies to seeking beauty in the soul, then in wisdom, and finally in the divine itself. It was an ambitious path, desire as a bridge to eternity. But surrounding this lofty speech were others far less ethereal, like Aristophanes' comic tale that humans were originally round beings split in two by the gods, forever searching for their missing halves. It's both absurd and touching, like imagining we're all walking around as broken eggs hoping to bump into our matching yolk. In that laughter and longing, the Greeks captured the paradox of human desire. It is ridiculous, profound, and deeply universal. What's striking about these symposia is that they were not only about words, but also about bodies. The setting itself encouraged intimacy. Men reclining side by side, drinking from shared vessels, exchanging glances and gestures as they spoke. Discussions of philosophy became infused with an erotic charge, as if wisdom itself was an act of seduction. Teachers and students were often bound together not only by ideas, but by personal attachments. And while this dynamic is fraught by modern standards, in their context it was considered natural that knowledge and desire were intertwined. To learn was to love, and to love was to approach truth. It turns the entire modern notion of objectivity upside down. Imagine if your professor declared that the best way to understand mathematics was to fall hopelessly in love with it. These philosophical explorations did not remain confined to symposium walls. They influenced the way society viewed intimacy, binding desire with virtue and ethics. The Greeks believed that passion, when properly directed, could elevate rather than corrupt. To love wisely was to train the soul, to sharpen it like a blade. Yet they were also wary of how love could consume and unbalance. Plato warned of desire that clung too tightly to the flesh, trapping people in obsession rather than freeing them toward higher ideals. It's the same paradox that haunts us today. How do you embrace passion without being devoured by it? The Greeks didn't solve it, but they dramatized it beautifully. The stories that emerged from these dialogues still resonate. Take Alcibiades, the brilliant but reckless Athenian, who stumbled drunk into Plato's Symposium to declare his love for Socrates in front of everyone. His confession was messy, vulnerable, and full of contradictions, equal parts comedy and tragedy. In that moment, philosophy wasn't an abstract debate, but a living, breathing tangle of human longing. We see in Alcibiades the eternal truth. No matter how brilliant we are, love has the power to reduce us to rambling fools in front of an audience. It's strangely comforting, isn't it? Even the most celebrated leaders of ancient Athens couldn't keep their composure when their hearts got involved. The influence of these philosophical reflections stretched beyond the symposium. Later thinkers would adapt the Greek notion of eros, blending it into Roman philosophy, Christian theology, and eventually the foundations of modern psychology. Freud himself, millennia later, would resurrect the word eros to describe the primal life force of desire. In other words, the drunken musings of Greeks in candlelit rooms echo even in therapists' offices today. That continuity reminds us that while civilizations collapse and languages fade, the struggle to understand love and lust never goes out of fashion. What makes these tales so captivating is how they fused opposites: reason with passion, comedy with tragedy, the carnal with the eternal. The Greeks refused to isolate desire into a corner of life. They let it permeate everything. A feast became a stage for philosophy, a joke became a revelation, and love became the very ladder to the gods. The result is a vision of humanity that is both humbling and exhilarating. We are creatures who laugh at crude stories one moment and dream of eternity the next, who stumble drunk in declarations of love, yet dare to imagine desire as a force that could guide us to truth itself. And perhaps that's why their rituals, myths, and philosophies remain magnetic. They remind us that desire is not something to be neatly categorized or suppressed, but something to be wrestled with, celebrated, and transformed. It is the chaos that fuels creation, the laughter that softens grief, the longing that pushes us beyond ourselves. The Greeks knew that to understand eros was to understand what it means to be human, with all the beauty, absurdity, and yearning that entails. And the question that lingers is whether we, with all our sophistication, are any closer to mastering it, or if we're still, like Aristophanes' split beings, stumbling in the dark, searching for our missing halves. In ancient Greece, desire was not confined to temples, symposiums, or even battlefields. It spilled into the theater, where plays became laboratories for exploring the boundaries of passion, excess, and shame. Imagine sitting in a massive amphitheater carved into the hillside, surrounded by thousands of spectators, as actors in masks shouted, sang, and danced their way through stories that often laid bare the strangest, most uncomfortable truths about human longing. Theater was entertainment, yes, but it was also confession, therapy, and sometimes mockery. It was where a community confronted its desires in public, disguising them with costumes and myth, yet making them impossible to ignore. Greek comedy, especially, thrived on sexual humor. Aristophanes filled his plays with bawdy jokes, outrageous innuendo, and scenes so shameless that even modern audiences might squirm. In Lysistrata, women withhold sex from their husbands to force them to end a war, and the result is a parade of men stumbling around the stage in exaggerated costumes with comic, very visible erections. The audience roared with laughter. But beneath the comedy was a serious truth. Desire was powerful enough to stop battles and redirect politics. What we call dirty jokes today were, for the Greeks, tools to unmask the hypocrisy of power and to remind everyone, politicians, generals, and citizens alike, that they were still subject to the most basic urges of the body. Yet it wasn't only comedy that played with eros. Greek tragedy also wove desire into its darkest plots, often showing how unchecked passion could lead to ruin. Think of Euripides' Hippolytus, where Phaedra falls desperately in love with her stepson, a love she cannot confess but cannot escape. Her longing eats away at her until it becomes destructive, leading to false accusations, shattered honor, and ultimately death. The audience sat and watched as desire transformed from something beautiful into something poisonous. It was a warning, yes, but also a mirror. Tragedy forced the Greeks to face the possibility that what made life rich could also make it unbearable. There is something deeply human about this tension between comedy and tragedy, between laughing at desire and being destroyed by it. It's the same reason modern audiences can enjoy a raunchy sitcom one night and a devastating drama about infidelity the next. The Greeks already understood that longing is never just one thing. It is ridiculous, it is sublime, it is dangerous, and it is healing. To capture it fully, they needed both the low humor of phallic jokes and the high poetry of tragic monologues. And maybe that's why their theater still resonates. It gives us permission to feel the entire spectrum of desire without sanitizing it. Beyond the stage, these performances carried communal weight. Festivals like the Dionysia brought entire cities together to watch plays dedicated to Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and yes, sexual frenzy. The experience was immersive. Spectators drank, cheered, argued, and even wept together. It was not so much a passive audience as a civic ritual where everyone confronted the truths of human passion as a collective. It's hard to imagine today thousands of people simultaneously laughing at jokes about erections or crying over doomed love affairs. But for the Greeks, This shared catharsis was essential. Theater wasn't an escape from life, it was life amplified, exposed, and ritualized. Even the masks and costumes carried layers of meaning. Male actors often played female roles, their exaggerated voices and gestures reminding everyone that gender itself could be performed, that identity could shift as easily as a mask. Desire, too, was performative, shaped by roles and expectations. Watching a man in a mask play a woman longing for forbidden love was more than entertainment. It was an exploration of the fluidity of human passion. The Greeks may not have had our vocabulary for identity and sexuality, but they staged its complexity every time the curtain rose. And here's the irony. While these plays were drenched in sexual humor and passion, they were also officially sanctioned by the state. City leaders funded productions, judges awarded prizes, and priests presided over performances. Desire wasn't treated as something to be hidden away. It was celebrated openly, even institutionalized. Imagine a government today sponsoring a national festival that included actors running around in oversized phallus costumes. It sounds absurd, but that absurdity was exactly the point. The Greeks knew that by laughing at desire together, they could tame its chaos, acknowledge its power, and perhaps learn to live with it more honestly. What lingers from these theatrical explorations is a paradox that still challenges us. Desire can be the butt of a joke or the cause of a downfall. It can bind communities together in shared laughter or tear families apart in whispered shame. The Greeks confronted all these possibilities with masks, wine, and stories, reminding us that the stage is never just a stage. It's a mirror, and the reflection it shows is not always flattering, but it is always true. Perhaps that's why, centuries later, we still turn to art when desire confuses us. Whether in films, songs, or plays, we seek out stories that let us laugh at our foolishness or cry at our mistakes. The Greeks taught us that eros demands expression, whether in tragedy, comedy, or some wild combination of both. And maybe that's the point. Desire itself is theater, and we are all actors stumbling through our parts, never quite sure if we're in a comedy or a tragedy until the curtain finally falls. The Greeks did not keep their explorations of desire confined to temples or theaters. They let it seep into their daily rituals, their festivals, and even their drinking games. One of the most fascinating examples was the symposium, a social gathering where men reclined on couches, passed around wine mixed with water, and indulged in conversations that drifted from politics to philosophy to, quite often, sex. But the symposium was not just a drunken party, it was structured chaos. A symposiarch, or master of ceremonies, decided how strong the wine would be, and once that decision was made, the night could turn into anything from a serious intellectual discussion to an orgy of laughter, music, and lust. It was a reminder that desire, like wine, was best appreciated when diluted, because too much of it could intoxicate to the point of destruction. What's amusing is that the Greeks genuinely believed watering down wine was a sign of civilization. Drinking it pure was seen as barbaric, a habit of uncultured people who lacked self-control. So they would sit there, sipping their careful mixtures, congratulating themselves on their moderation, even as they slid deeper into wild games and seductions. There's something delightfully ironic about people patting themselves on the back for restraint while debating philosophy with one hand and trying to kiss their neighbor with the other. It's proof that humans have always been experts at self-deception, telling ourselves we are in control even when we're obviously not. The symposium was also where music, poetry, and flirtation intertwined. Courtesans, known as hetairai, were often invited to perform, converse, and sometimes become the object of more intimate attention. These women were not ordinary prostitutes. They were educated, witty, and trained to entertain intellectually as much as physically. In many ways, they occupied a paradoxical space, excluded from traditional roles of wives and mothers, yet given influence over some of the most powerful men in Athens. The hetairai embodied how eros could destabilize social boundaries, forcing men to see women not just as domestic figures, but as intellectual companions and erotic equals. The games played at symposia also carried undertones of desire. One of the most famous was Kottabos, where participants flung the dregs of their wine at a target, often while reciting the name of a lover. If they hit the mark, it was seen as a sign that their affection would be returned. It was like an ancient version of truth or dare, except with more spilt wine and broken pottery. The act itself, both ridiculous and tender, reminds us that rituals of love have always involved silly games. Today, we might swipe left or right on a screen. Back then, they were tossing wine at each other. The methods change, but the awkwardness of romance never really does. Yet beneath the humor and chaos of these nights was a deeper truth. The symposium was a stage where the Greeks tested the boundaries of eros in both playful and serious ways. The conversations about love recorded by Plato and Xenophon sprang from these settings, where intoxication loosened tongues and lowered defenses. The blend of wine, desire, and philosophy created an atmosphere where people dared to say things they might otherwise hide. In a sense, the symposium was both a party and a confessional booth, with Dionysus himself presiding as the god of revelry and release. The influence of these gatherings rippled outward. They shaped the way Greek society understood relationships between men and women, and even between citizens and the divine. The intertwining of desire and dialogue at symposia helped form the philosophical backbone of Western thought about love. It was not sterile, detached reasoning, but something messy, passionate, and often ridiculous. And maybe that's the point. The Greeks knew that truth rarely emerges in silence, but in the clamor of voices, laughter, and the warmth of wine. Thinking about this today, we might laugh at the absurdity of men in flowing robes spilling their drinks while debating the nature of the soul, but in reality, we're not so different. Modern dinner parties, office happy hours, and late-night bar conversations follow the same logic. Mix alcohol with attraction, and watch as inhibitions dissolve into honesty, or at least something that feels like honesty at the time. The Greeks simply elevated it into ritual, giving it the weight of culture rather than dismissing it as frivolous. And so the symposium leaves us with a curious lesson. Desire, when acknowledged and given a place, becomes a source of creativity, laughter, and connection. When denied or repressed, it tends to erupt in ways far less manageable. Perhaps that's why the Greeks insisted on celebrating it openly, even when it led to embarrassment. They understood that longing cannot be neatly tucked away. It must be poured into cups, sung in songs, and even splattered against the walls in silly games. And in that messy, intoxicating honesty lies a truth about human nature, that our deepest insights often arrive not when we are sober and serious, but when we are laughing, half-drunk, and daring enough to admit what we truly want. Desire in ancient Greece was never simply a matter of private indulgence. It was bound up with politics, power, and the ways communities defined themselves. To see this clearly, one only has to look at how the Greeks connected eros with citizenship and control. For them, love and passion weren't isolated from public life. They believed that who you loved, how you expressed that love, and the roles you played within relationships had consequences for the stability of the city-state. It may sound strange at first. Why would a government care about who people desired? But in the Greek worldview, eros wasn't just personal. It was a force that could either strengthen the bonds of society or unravel them entirely. In Athens, for example, the mentoring relationships between older men and younger boys were not just tolerated, but in many ways idealized as part of a civic culture. These bonds, which mixed pedagogy, intimacy, and sometimes erotic attachment, were seen as a way to train young men for the responsibilities of adulthood. Desire here was channeled toward an educational purpose, producing citizens who were not only physically strong, but also intellectually and morally shaped by the affections of their mentors. It's unsettling by modern standards. Yet for the Athenians, it was a way of weaving eros into the fabric of civic life. Love wasn't a distraction from duty. It was a tool for creating better citizens. But this system also revealed the contradictions of Greek society. While certain forms of same-sex desire were celebrated as noble, others were ridiculed or condemned. Plays like Aristophanes' comedies mocked men who failed to grow out of their youthful roles into responsible adults. There was an unspoken rule. Desire was acceptable so long as it served the social order. Cross the line into excess or threatened the balance of power, and what was once praised became shameful. In this way, love itself became a political act. To desire correctly was to prove loyalty to the city. To desire wrongly was to risk chaos. The Spartans took this intertwining of eros and politics even further. Known for their militarism, they encouraged bonds between male warriors, believing that soldiers who loved one another would fight more fiercely side by side. Desire became a weapon harnessed for the defense of the state. It's almost romantic in a brutal way. Imagine an army so tightly bound by affection that betrayal seemed unthinkable. Yet at the same time, it reveals how eros could be co-opted, turned into a tool of discipline in war. It wasn't about personal freedom, but about channeling longing into loyalty, making sure passion served the needs of the collective. What's fascinating is how all of this still speaks to our world today. Governments may no longer openly organize relationships to train warriors or mold citizens, but desire is still politicized. Who people love, how they express it, and what rights they gain or lose because of it remain fiercely debated. The Greeks show us that this isn't new. It's just a different version of the same struggle. Whenever love pushes against established power, it becomes more than personal. It becomes revolutionary. At the same time, Greek myths reflected these tensions in symbolic form. Stories of gods pursuing mortals, of forbidden liaisons punished by tragedy, and of passion overturning empires all spoke to the anxiety that Eros was too wild to control completely. Zeus's endless affairs, Aphrodite's schemes, or even the doomed love of Paris and Helen weren't just juicy tales. They were warnings and reflections of how desire could destabilize entire cities. The Trojan War, after all, was said to have started with a single stolen kiss. That's the kind of story that makes you laugh and shudder at once. Imagine telling your citizens they must fight for 10 years because someone couldn't resist an affair. It's absurd, yet it captures the dangerous potential the Greeks always saw lurking inside love. And in the midst of this seriousness, there was always comedy. They laughed at their leaders, at themselves, and at the absurd ways passion made fools of even the most powerful men. A general could lose his reputation over a scandalous romance. A politician could be mocked for chasing the wrong lover, and poets filled their works with jokes about infidelity and seduction. The humor didn't erase the seriousness of desire's power, it highlighted it. By laughing together, the Greeks acknowledged that Eros was both a danger and a delight, something that could embarrass them one moment and inspire them the next. That duality is perhaps the deepest truth the Greeks left us. Desire is never neutral. It shapes societies as much as it shapes individuals, guiding choices, inspiring art, fueling wars, and sparking revolutions. It is both creative and destructive, both ridiculous and profound. And maybe that's why their stories still hold us. Because when we listen to them, we recognize ourselves. Not in the exact details, but in the messy, chaotic, exhilarating way love continues to define our lives. And so, in the echo of their plays, their festivals, and their myths, we're left with the uneasy realization that Eros was never meant to be tamed entirely. It was meant to be lived with, wrestled with, laughed at, and feared. The Greeks understood that to be human was to be ruled, at least in part, by longing. And perhaps the most dangerous and the most beautiful truth of all is that they were right. The Greeks carried desire not only into their temples, their theaters, and their politics, but also into the most sacred spaces of daily life, the home and the family. To us, the household might seem like a private refuge, a place where passion is quieter, contained. But in Greece, the family was not just personal. It was an institution woven tightly into the city-state. And even within its walls, Eros was always present, shaping roles, expectations, and hidden tensions. Marriage itself was less about romance and more about strategy, a union between families rather than hearts. Husbands sought wives who would produce legitimate heirs, keep the oikos, the household, running, and preserve family honor. Love, if it arrived, was considered a pleasant accident rather than the foundation. Yet desire never followed rules, even in arranged unions. While wives were often confined to domestic spaces, their husbands roamed freely, finding Eros in symposiums, courtesans, or fleeting affairs. The imbalance was glaring, and it shows that Greek society constantly tried to regulate passion without ever truly succeeding. Men justified their freedom as a natural right, while women were warned of disgrace should they stray. And yet, the very existence of love poems by women like Sappho, whispering of longing and intimacy, shows that desire persisted even in the shadows. Imagine a world where your husband's passion was a public affair, while yours was a carefully hidden secret. It created a tension that no amount of household order could smooth over. Weddings themselves revealed this tension between order and longing. The ceremonies were filled with rituals, from processions to offerings, designed to bring harmony between husband and wife. But beneath the chants and blessings lurked a sense of unease. Newlyweds were often strangers, and the hope was that shared duty would eventually blossom into affection. It's almost comical in a bittersweet way. A society that worshipped Aphrodite and filled its art with images of rapture also built its marriages on practical contracts and dowries. It's like celebrating Valentine's Day by signing a mortgage. Pragmatic, but hardly romantic. Still, within these unions, Eros found cracks to seep through. Husbands, despite their freedom, sometimes fell genuinely in love with their wives, composing verses or commissioning statues in their honor. Wives, often underestimated, shaped their households with quiet authority, turning duty into devotion in ways that outsiders rarely saw. And children born of these unions carried both the weight of civic expectation and the unspoken legacy of passion. For the Greeks, the family was not only a place of reproduction, but also a stage for the ongoing negotiation between desire and duty. This negotiation echoed in myths as well, where families torn apart by lust and betrayal were common. Think of Agamemnon returning home from Troy only to be murdered by Clytemnestra, who had taken a lover during his absence, or the tragic story of Phaedra and Hippolytus, where forbidden desire within a family unit led to destruction. These tales weren't just cautionary. They mirrored real anxieties about what could happen when Eros ignored the boundaries of the household. The myths whispered what people knew but rarely said aloud, that passion could turn the safest place into the most dangerous. And yet, despite all the rules, ceremonies, and warnings, desire within the home remained unstoppable. Children grew up watching it play out, learning from both the hypocrisies and the tenderness of their parents. Servants saw the secret liaisons, the whispered arguments, the moments of vulnerability that families tried to keep hidden. Even the walls of the house seemed to carry the imprint of longing, as if every space where people lived together also became a space where Eros lingered. The paradox is almost humorous. A society obsessed with controlling desire ended up weaving it into every corner of life, even where it claimed to keep it out. Perhaps the Greeks knew deep down that longing cannot be contained, no matter how many rituals are performed or laws are written. Maybe that's why their art, their poetry, and their stories keep circling back to the same theme. Desire is not something you manage, it's something you live with, often awkwardly, sometimes painfully, but always intensely. And so the home, with its rules and secrets, became one more stage where Eros performed, sometimes quietly, sometimes explosively. The Greeks understood that to build a family was to invite longing into its walls, with all the laughter, tears, and contradictions that came with it. It was never just about survival or duty. It was always, in some unspoken way, about the messiness of being human, the impossibility of separating love from life, and the strange comedy of trying to regulate something as untamable as desire. In ancient Greece, desire was not confined to temples, homes, or battlefields. It spilled into the public spaces that shaped collective identity. Festivals, markets, and theaters were not only venues for entertainment or trade, but arenas where Eros could be displayed, provoked, and even ritualized. The Greeks loved spectacle, and they knew that passion was most powerful when seen and shared. Imagine a crowd of citizens gathering in a theater, ostensibly to watch a play about gods and heroes, but secretly drawn in by the moments where love and lust tipped into chaos. These were not just performances. They were reflections of the crowd's own secret longings, safely projected onto the stage. Take the plays of Euripides, where desire often erupted in terrifying, hilarious, or tragic form. In his Hippolytus, a queen's forbidden passion for her stepson destroys an entire family, while in the Bacchae, Dionysus lures women into ecstatic frenzy, blurring the line between religious devotion and sensual abandon. Audiences gasped, laughed, and sometimes squirmed, not because the stories were alien, but because they recognized themselves in the excess. The theater became a mirror, exposing how easily Eros could overwhelm reason and how quickly dignity could collapse into frenzy. If you've ever sat through a play or a film where the audience nervously laughs because the scene hits too close to home, you'd understand the uncomfortable honesty of Greek tragedy. Even comedy played its part. Aristophanes filled his plays with sexual jokes, absurd couplings, and exaggerated portrayals of lust. His work might make modern audiences blush, but the laughter served a purpose. By mocking desire, the Greeks acknowledged its control over them without pretending it was purely noble. Humor became a tool for disarming Eros, making it less threatening by turning it into spectacle. And yet, beneath the laughter, the truth lingered. Desire is never ridiculous to the one who feels it. It's only funny when you're safely in the audience, watching someone else stumble. Public festivals amplified this even further. During the celebrations of Dionysus, wine flowed, masks hid identities, and boundaries blurred. People danced in the streets, sang bawdy songs, and allowed themselves to behave in ways they never would in ordinary life. The anonymity of the crowd gave permission for release. In these moments, Eros was not private. It was communal, a collective intoxication. It's fascinating to realize that the Greeks created occasions where breaking the rules was the point, because they knew repression without release only bred disaster. It was, in a sense, a societal safety valve. Better to let everyone indulge for a night than to risk an explosion later. Markets, too, carried an undercurrent of desire. The Agoras wasn't just a place to buy olives and discuss politics. It was also a stage for flirtation and display. Young men showed off their physiques, women maneuvered through crowds, and merchants joked with double meanings. Even in the bustle of trade, Eros found space to perform. Perhaps it's not so different from how modern malls or cafes become places of courtship as much as consumption. We pretend we're there to shop or eat, but half the time, we're scanning the room for faces and eyes that linger. What all these examples reveal is that Eros in Greece was not something hidden away, but something woven into the fabric of public life. The city-state itself seemed to acknowledge that love and lust were too potent to confine. Instead, it offered controlled outlets, festivals, theater, public games, where desire could be played out safely, even extravagantly. But in doing so, it also exposed the fragile line between celebration and chaos. A festival might end in revelry, or it might end in violence, depending on how far the crowd let Dionysus carry them. This tension feels deeply familiar. Even today, concerts, carnivals, and parades carry the same dangerous thrill, the sense that, in the anonymity of the crowd, we can let go of restraint. We laugh, we flirt, we drink, and we pretend it's all just fun. Yet part of us knows that what drives the energy is not only joy, but also desire, a longing to be seen, touched, or carried away by something larger than ourselves. The Greeks understood this long before us. They knew that Eros was never simply private. It was always a public force, shaping how people gathered, celebrated, and even governed. And perhaps that's the most enduring lesson of their festivals and theaters, that desire is not a shadow to be hidden, but a fire to be tended carefully. Left unchecked, it can consume, but denied completely, it erupts in far stranger ways. The Greeks laughed at it, sang of it, staged it, and danced with it, knowing that only by acknowledging its presence could they live with it. And in that recognition lies a truth that still stirs us today. No matter how much we evolve, desire remains the quiet script beneath every public performance of our lives. The Greeks understood something that many of us still struggle with today. Desire was not just about physical attraction, it was also about power, reputation, and influence. Eros didn't just live in bedrooms or temples, it stalked the arenas of politics and leadership, shaping decisions that changed the course of history. When we look at the stories of great statesmen and philosophers, we often focus on their ideas or their victories. But beneath those marble busts, there were human beings driven by longing, jealousy, and sometimes scandalous entanglements. Take Pericles, the great Athenian leader, who reshaped democracy and expanded Athens' empire. His political genius was legendary, but his personal life was just as fascinating. He fell in love with Aspasia, a courtesan from Miletus, who became not only his partner but also a major influence on his political and cultural vision. Aspasia was intelligent, outspoken, and skilled in rhetoric, so skilled, in fact, that even Socrates is said to have admired her wit. Their relationship scandalized Athens because she wasn't a citizen, and yet she hosted salons that drew the brightest minds of the city. It's almost comedic to think of grumpy old politicians whispering about how a woman might be steering the leader of Athens while pretending they weren't jealous of her brilliance. Desire in politics was often messy. Alliances formed and dissolved not just because of strategy, but because of affection or betrayal. Philosophers like Plato liked to imagine that states should be governed by pure reason, but the reality was far less tidy. Personal rivalries were fueled by attraction and envy as much as by ideology. It's not unlike watching modern politics, where scandals involving affairs, texts, or secret liaisons sometimes topple careers faster than any policy failure. Human weakness, it turns out, has always been part of leadership. Even philosophy itself wasn't immune. Plato's dialogues often framed love as a path toward higher truths, with Eros serving as a ladder from physical attraction to spiritual enlightenment. But let's be honest, these lofty theories came from conversations in symposiums, where men reclined with wine and often blurred the line between intellectual admiration and personal infatuation. The boundary between student and lover was not always clear, and mentorship often carried undertones of desire. It makes you wonder how many great philosophical insights were born not just from abstract reasoning, but from someone trying desperately to impress the object of their affection. The intertwining of politics, philosophy, and Eros created a culture where power and passion reinforced each other. A charismatic leader could stir both admiration and longing, while a well-placed relationship could grant access to influence and privilege. It's the same pattern we still see today when charm, image, and seduction play as much of a role in public life as competence. If you've ever watched a politician's speech and noticed how much of the audience was captivated not by the words but by the delivery, you've glimpsed a phenomenon the Greeks would have recognized instantly. And beneath it all was a persistent irony. While Greek thinkers wrote endlessly about self-control, moderation, and balance, their own lives were full of entanglements that proved how elusive those ideals really were. The tension between the philosophy of restraint and the reality of passion created a society that was both disciplined and chaotic, brilliant and flawed. The Greeks didn't hide from this contradiction. They staged it, debated it, and even laughed at it. Perhaps that honesty is what allowed them to explore Eros so deeply, not as something to conquer, but as something to live with. What's striking is how timeless this all feels. Our modern leaders, celebrities, and thinkers still navigate the same entanglements, the same blurred lines between public image and private longing. We may wrap it in different language, with scandals trending on social media instead of whispered in the agora, but the pattern hasn't changed. Desire still pulls the strings, often more than reason would like to admit. And in that realization lies both a warning and a comfort. The warning is that Eros can destabilize even the strongest institutions when left unchecked. The comfort is that this has always been true, and somehow societies have survived, even thrived, by acknowledging the role of passion in shaping their destiny. The Greeks, with all their brilliance and folly, left us a reminder that we are not alone in our contradictions. Desire will always sneak into the council chamber, the classroom, and the stage, reshaping history in ways both profound and ridiculous, and perhaps that is why their stories continue to resonate, because they remind us that behind every monument, every law, and every idea, there beats the same messy, yearning heart. In the Greek world, the line between sacred ritual and sensual expression was never as rigid as we might imagine. Temples were not just houses of prayer, they were living theaters where the body could become a vessel for the divine. Within certain sanctuaries, particularly those dedicated to deities of fertility and love, worshippers engaged in acts that fused reverence with passion. To modernize, this looks like a contradiction. How could desire be holy? But to the Greeks, Eros was not merely tolerated, it was an essential force that connected humanity to the gods. One of the most intriguing aspects of this was the practice of sacred prostitution. In cities like Corinth, priestesses of Aphrodite were said to offer their bodies not as objects of commerce, but as instruments of devotion. Their encounters with worshippers were framed as acts of piety, where pleasure itself was transformed into a prayer. Think about the radical nature of this idea. Instead of denying the flesh in pursuit of the spirit, the Greeks embraced the body as a gateway to the divine. It's a perspective that almost flips the script on centuries of later moral teaching. where desire was cast as the enemy of holiness. Here, the temple did not silence Eros, it sanctified it. These rituals were often wrapped in layers of symbolism. The union of priestess and worshipper was not just about two individuals, it was imagined as a reenactment of cosmic forces, a way of aligning human longing with the fertility of the earth and the cycles of life. When a man entered Aphrodite's temple and offered himself to her servants, he wasn't simply seeking personal pleasure, at least not officially. He was participating in a drama where his desire echoed the eternal dance of creation itself. Whether he truly thought about cosmic harmony in the moment is another question, but the ritual gave him permission to feel that his yearning was part of something larger, something eternal. It's tempting to wonder what the atmosphere inside such a temple felt like. Was it hushed and reverent, with incense filling the air and solemn prayers accompanying the act? Or was it vibrant and celebratory, with music, laughter, and a sense of freedom from ordinary rules? Perhaps it was both, depending on the moment and the participants. But either way, the temple dissolved the wall between passion and piety. To the Greek mind, the gods themselves were not chaste beings. They were deeply entangled in affairs, seductions, and unions of every sort. If Zeus could pursue mortal women in the guise of swans and bulls, then why shouldn't his worshippers find holiness in the arms of one another? Of course, not everyone in Greece viewed these practices without controversy. Philosophers sometimes raised eyebrows at the blending of lust and sanctity, and satirists poked fun at what looked suspiciously like excuses for indulgence. Yet even the critiques revealed something important. Eros was too powerful to be ignored. It forced itself into the center of religious life because the Greeks understood that spirituality without passion becomes brittle. They may not have had our language of psychology, but they intuited that repressing desire only makes it more dangerous. Better to weave it into ritual, to tame it by giving it a place on the altar, than to let it fester in shadows. And here lies a lesson that still feels strikingly modern. We live in societies that often oscillate between indulgence and repression, between advertising that sells everything through sex and moral voices that warn against it. The Greeks offer an alternative, a vision where desire can be sacred, where longing can be acknowledged as part of the divine fabric of existence. Whether or not one agrees with their practices, there is something undeniably compelling about a worldview that refuses to pit the body against the spirit. What makes this all the more fascinating is how it shaped cultural imagination. Myths, poetry, and even architecture carry the imprint of this sacred eroticism. A column might be carved to suggest fertility, a hymn might blur the line between devotion and seduction, and a story of the gods might sound suspiciously like a tale of human longing dressed up in divine clothes. When desire was everywhere, from temples to theaters, it naturally left its fingerprints on every aspect of art and life. And perhaps the real brilliance of the Greeks was their honesty about this. Instead of pretending that humans could ascend to the heavens by denying their most basic instincts, they found ways to bring heaven down into the embrace of human passion. It was messy, complicated, sometimes scandalous, but it was real. And in that messiness, they created a culture that felt alive in every sense, where the divine was never remote, but always pulsing through the laughter, the music, and even the touch of another human being. That intertwining of sacred and sensual was not a sideshow of Greek religion. It was its beating heart. And it reminds us that the boundaries we draw between holiness and desire are not fixed laws of nature, but choices. Choices that say as much about our fears as they do about our ideals. The Greeks chose to embrace Eros as a force of connection, and in doing so, they left us with a vision of humanity that is at once shocking, humorous, and strangely liberating. It's the kind of vision that makes us question our own assumptions about what it means to be holy, and perhaps makes us laugh at how often we take our discomfort more seriously than our joy. When night fell in ancient Greece, the city didn't always go to sleep. In fact, it often woke up in new ways. Behind closed doors, away from the agora and the temples, gatherings took place where wine flowed freely. Songs turned into chants, and inhibitions slipped away like sandals at the edge of a bed. These were not public festivals sanctioned by the state, but intimate feasts of indulgence, where private citizens gathered to taste freedom, to experiment with pleasure, and to create their own microcosms of ecstasy. If the official rituals were performed in honor of gods, these nocturnal assemblies felt like offerings to the gods within, the unruly, mischievous spirits that lived in every human body. The Greeks called some of these encounters theosoi, informal cult groups that blended worship with entertainment. You might imagine a simple dinner party, but quickly the atmosphere would shift into something closer to a theatrical performance of desire. Guests reclined on couches, sipping from kylixes, while musicians plucked lyres and flutes provided hypnotic melodies. What began as conversation could escalate into philosophical debates or erotic games, depending on the company and the mood. The line between symposium and orgy was often one good joke, one bold suggestion, or one cup of wine too many. And the Greeks were very good at making sure the cups never stayed empty. It's easy to imagine the mix of seriousness and absurdity in those rooms. a young man reciting a poem to impress his lover, while an older philosopher interrupts with a critique, only for laughter to break the tension. Someone dares another to perform a dance, and suddenly the solemnity of Homeric verses dissolves into playful chaos. Desire did not need a stage. It played itself out in these shifting rhythms of intimacy and spontaneity. The beauty of it all was how unashamedly human it was, how it celebrated vulnerability and longing as part of the experience rather than something to hide. What makes these moments even more striking is the way they blurred the boundaries of identity. Age, class, and status could bend under the intoxication of wine and the intensity of desire. The wealthy aristocrat and the humble poet might find themselves in the same embrace, their roles suspended in the fever of the night. This was not just pleasure, it was social alchemy, a temporary undoing of rigid hierarchies that ruled daily life. The Greeks, for all their strictness in public life, created spaces where the private realm allowed for a surprising elasticity of rules. It's almost comical to picture a senator arguing in court by day about the dangers of indulgence, only to end up at night sharing grapes in the lap of someone half his age, whispering lines from Euripides as though they were love letters. Even the architecture of Greek homes made space for this duality. The andron, the men's dining room, was designed specifically for symposiums, with couches arranged around the walls so participants could recline side by side, their bodies naturally drifting closer as the evening stretched on. Oil lamps glowed dimly, casting long shadows that could hide or reveal as much as the guests wished. The very structure of the room seemed to encourage the mingling of minds and bodies, reminding us that desire was not an accident of the night, but something planned into the design of life itself. And if someone thinks this sounds decadent, it's worth noting that the Greeks didn't always separate decadence from wisdom. For them, the symposium wasn't just a drinking party, it was also a stage for philosophy. Plato's Symposium is the most famous example, where men drank together and delivered speeches about love. Yet even that lofty dialogue carries the unmistakable undertone of flirtation, rivalry, and seduction. Imagine being in the room, one man delivering a speech about love leading the soul to eternal truth, while another tries to make eye contact with the boy across the table, hoping that his truth will be rewarded with something far more immediate. It's both profound and hilarious, a reminder that humans have always struggled to keep their ideals and their impulses in the same conversation without tripping over themselves. What emerges from these nights is a portrait of desire not as something chaotic, but as something woven into the fabric of community. Pleasure was not isolated from friendship or philosophy. It lived alongside them, creating bonds that could be as lasting as they were fleeting. A touch, a kiss, a shared cup of wine could carry as much significance as a speech in the assembly. In this way, the private rituals of desire shaped the public culture, reminding everyone that behind the laws and the politics were human beings whose lives pulsed with longing. And perhaps this is the real secret the Greeks left us, that desire is not an interruption of life, but a part of it, as essential as eating or speaking. They built spaces, created rituals, and told stories that honored it, even when it was inconvenient or scandalous. We might laugh at their extravagance or shake our heads at their contradictions, but beneath it all is a recognition of something timeless, that to be human is to be pulled by forces that reason alone cannot govern, and it is in surrendering, at least for a moment, to those forces that life often feels most alive. The Greeks didn't always control their nights, but maybe that was the point. By allowing desire to spill into their gatherings, they found a kind of freedom that politics and philosophy alone could never provide. And in that freedom, they discovered not just passion, but a strange kind of truth, one that still resonates every time we remember that laughter, love, and longing can sometimes teach us more than reason ever could. The Greeks were masters at making everything into a performance, and nowhere was this clearer than in the way they merged sexuality with theater. Imagine a city festival where the stage was not simply about watching actors, but about watching human desires dramatized in ways that blurred the line between sacred ritual, civic entertainment, and intimate confession. Comedy, tragedy, and satyr plays all carried undertones of erotic tension, and sometimes they didn't even bother to keep the undertones subtle. The actors wore masks, yes, but the performances were often anything but masked. A satyr play, for example, featured half-animal, half-human creatures with exaggerated phalluses, running around the stage in a frenzy of lust and mischief. It was hilarious, ridiculous, and yet somehow deeply symbolic, as if the Greeks were telling themselves that laughter and arousal were both essential tools for confronting the absurdity of existence. These performances weren't confined to the theater. They spilled into festivals where dancers whirled in processions, flutes screeched wildly, and bodies moved with an abandon that seemed to mock the constraints of daily life. It's almost impossible for us to picture a modern equivalent. Imagine a Broadway show where, halfway through, the actors and audience all decide to throw off social etiquette and join in the performance. The Greeks didn't necessarily expect you to sit still and clap politely. They wanted you to feel something visceral, to be caught up in the chaos of the moment. And when wine mixed with music and the chants of Dionysian hymns echoed through the night, It was less about art as product and more about art as possession, as if everyone in attendance was being pulled into a force larger than themselves. The curious thing is how naturally they fused comedy and the erotic. Laughter was part of the ritual, not an interruption of it. Think of Aristophanes' plays, where jokes about lust, impotence, and seduction ran rampant. On one level, they were pure entertainment. On another, they acted as social commentary, poking fun at the seriousness of politicians and philosophers who pretended to live above desire. It's as if the Greeks instinctively knew that humor could say things about sex and power that solemn speeches could not. And isn't that still true today? We often learn more about our culture's insecurities through its jokes than through its laws. But there was also a darker side to this theatricality, one that reveals the intensity of Greek rituals. When Dionysian troops performed, they sometimes entered a frenzy so overwhelming that participants lost awareness of themselves. This wasn't just acting, it was possession, an ecstatic state where boundaries of self dissolved. In those moments, the body was no longer an individual body, but part of a larger current, moving and writhing in sync with others. What might look to us like chaos carried a sense of transcendence for those inside it. It's the paradox of freedom through surrender. By losing yourself, you gained access to something divine. The masks in Greek theater capture this paradox perfectly. On stage, an actor's face was hidden behind a fixed expression, yet through that mask, audiences saw amplified truth. Desire, rage, longing. These emotions were stripped of nuance and presented in exaggerated form, forcing people to recognize them as part of their own lives. In the same way, erotic rituals exaggerated the human experience, showing it at its most intense so that participants could confront parts of themselves they might otherwise ignore. Sometimes, the best way to expose truth is not through subtlety, but through spectacle, a lesson the Greeks understood long before Hollywood. And yet, amid all the intensity, there was always humor, an almost defiant insistence on laughing in the middle of sacred chaos. Picture a grand procession with solemn hymns to Dionysus, suddenly interrupted by a prankster wearing an absurd costume and a comically oversized phallus. The crowd erupts in laughter, but the laughter doesn't diminish the sacred. It enhances it. The Greeks weren't afraid of mixing reverence with ridicule, perhaps, because they sensed that the gods themselves were not humorless beings, but creatures of contradiction. If Zeus could be both king of Olympus and a serial trickster, then surely a ritual could carry both solemnity and farce without collapsing under the tension. What's striking is how participatory this all was. You weren't just a passive observer in Greek culture. You were invited, sometimes pulled, into the drama. Whether in the theater, the symposium, or the streets during a festival, you were expected to feel, to laugh, to shout, to dance, to give yourself to the moment. And maybe that's the genius of it. Desire wasn't something cordoned off in private bedrooms or whispered confessions. It was woven into the public fabric of life, displayed openly in forms that blended art, ritual, and raw humanity. That blending reveals a culture that refused to treat sexuality as something marginal. It wasn't an afterthought. It wasn't a secret vice. It was a force that demanded expression alongside politics, philosophy, and religion. And by dramatizing it, the Greeks ensured it could be seen, talked about, laughed at, celebrated, and confronted. They gave Eros a stage, and in doing so, they gave themselves permission to wrestle with its power out loud. And maybe that's the detail that keeps this history alive. The Greeks' ability to turn desire into spectacle, to make people laugh and gasp and reflect all at once. It's the kind of cultural instinct that reminds us that the line between entertainment and revelation is often thinner than we think, and that sometimes the truths we remember most vividly are the ones that made us laugh while making us squirm. The stage of desire, in all its comedy and chaos, still whispers across centuries that human longing is never just private. It is theatrical, communal, and profoundly alive. Among the most intriguing aspects of ancient Greek culture was the way they treated wine as more than just a drink. For them, wine was a portal, a means of dissolving the rigid boundaries of social roles, and an excuse for gathering under the mysterious umbrella of Dionysus. To sit at a symposium was not only to sip and converse, but to enter a ritual that blurred the line between civility and chaos. The room would fill with laughter, philosophical arguments, flirtations, and eventually slurred confessions. Wine loosened the tongue, but in Greece, that loosening wasn't shameful. It was an intentional doorway to truth. After all, they had a saying, "In wine, there is truth." You could almost picture a stern philosopher holding his cup aloft, about to make a profound statement only to hiccup halfway through. And yet, everyone would nod, because sometimes hiccups carried more honesty than polished speeches. The symposium was where Eros mingled with intellect. Reclining on couches, men drank from decorated cups painted with scenes of revelry and seduction, while flute girls and dancers performed, weaving sensuality into the air. It was an atmosphere where the boundaries between teacher and student, elder and youth, blurred as freely as the diluted wine flowed from craters. Conversations leapt from the nature of the soul to the beauty of a lover's hair. It's funny to think that some of the loftiest ideas of Western philosophy might have been born just after someone spilled wine down their chest and decided that embarrassment was as worthy a subject as metaphysics. Desire in these gatherings was never purely physical. It was tied to admiration, mentorship, and even political maneuvering. A glance exchanged across a room, a jest whispered too close, a compliment disguised as philosophy. These were part of the erotic language of the symposium. Relationships formed in these contexts often carried as much weight as public alliances, blending pleasure with power. And here lies the paradox. While the Greeks celebrated physical beauty, they also insisted that true desire should inspire the soul, elevate it toward the divine. But, of course, their version of elevating the soul often began with a long night of drinking and a bold attempt at seduction disguised as a Socratic dialogue. The presence of entertainment made the atmosphere more combustible. A dancer might spin so close to a guest that his composure cracked, or a musician's song could shift the mood from raucous laughter to hushed awe. The interplay of bodies and sound turned a drinking party into a ritual of sensory immersion. You could imagine one guest trying to deliver a serious reflection on justice, while another interrupts with a joke about how even justice itself would blush in front of the dancer's curves. The serious and the playful didn't cancel each other out. They created a rhythm of rising tension, much like the steady intoxication that carried the night forward. Wine, of course, was always the silent conductor. But unlike our modern obsession with drinking games, the Greeks approached intoxication with a peculiar sense of balance. Too sober and you weren't really part of the fun. Too drunk and you became ridiculous. The art lay in hovering at that perfect middle point, tipsy enough to feel divine inspiration, but steady enough to carry on a debate or a seduction. It was almost a philosophy in itself. Wisdom was not found in extremes, but in the intoxicated middle. Though, if you asked someone staggering home barefoot at dawn, they might insist they had found God in the bottom of their cup. These gatherings reveal just how much the Greeks wove eros into every thread of life. To them, the erotic wasn't separate from philosophy, politics, or religion. It was the energy that animated all of them. Wine made it easier to admit that admiration and attraction drive many of our loftiest pursuits. And maybe they weren't wrong. How many modern business deals, friendships, or creative ideas have been sparked over drinks? The Greeks simply admitted openly what we prefer to pretend, that desire has always been a partner in our greatest accomplishments. And so, in the flickering lamplight of a symposium, with wine-stained lips and laughter echoing through marble halls, the Greeks dared to turn intoxication into a stage for both chaos and clarity. They allowed the body and the mind to collide without apology, trusting that something divine could emerge from the mess. And in that messy brilliance, they remind us that truth and desire rarely arrive in silence. They burst into the room together, loud, imperfect, and utterly unforgettable. In the world of ancient Greece, desire was never just about the body. It was also about memory, legacy, and the way one's presence lingered long after a night of passion had ended. They wove eros into the fabric of remembrance, using poetry and ritual as a way to immortalize fleeting encounters. To the Greeks, love was not simply felt in the moment. It was carried, written, and sung into eternity. Imagine lovers whose embraces vanished with dawn, only to be resurrected in verses that would outlive empires. For them, the act was temporary, but the story was forever. And maybe that's what makes the Greeks feel strangely modern. They knew instinctively that humans don't just crave intimacy, they crave for it to be remembered. The poets were the true alchemists of desire. Sappho of Lesbos, for instance, transformed the rush of attraction into lines that still make hearts tremble centuries later. Her fragments speak of trembling hands, flushed skin, and the paralyzing ache of being in someone's presence. These weren't abstract metaphors, they were the physical details of passion made divine. To read Sappho is to realize that longing in 600 BCE felt no different than longing today. She made desire portable, capable of crossing centuries, turning sweat and heartbeat into literature. You might laugh to think that your most embarrassing crush could someday inspire poetry of cosmic depth, but isn't that what she did? Take the small human moments and insist they were worth eternity? Even epigrams carved into stone carried this same erotic pulse. Tombstones often bore inscriptions, not just of names and dates, but of affection, longing, and sometimes cheeky reminders of past love affairs. A passerby could stumble across a grave and read not just of someone's death, but of someone's burning heart decades earlier. Death did not erase eros. It preserved it in marble, waiting for future eyes. There is something both comic and tragic about that. Imagine being remembered not for your political victories, but because you were exceptionally good looking and someone couldn't resist writing about it forever. The Greeks were shameless in their honesty. If beauty moved you, you declared it. If passion shook you, you wrote it. Silence was the true indecency. Rituals amplified this eternalizing instinct. Festivals for gods like Aphrodite and Dionysus often included processions filled with songs of past loves, satirical plays mocking jealous husbands, and hymns that treated erotic passion as divine revelation. In such settings, memory and desire fused into collective experience. It was no longer just two people tangled in longing. It became a community acknowledging that eros defined human existence. Even laughter at a bawdy play was part of this recognition. If you've ever chuckled at an inappropriate joke and realized it carried a slice of uncomfortable truth, you'd understand the Greek spirit. They laughed because they knew desire was absurd and irresistible in equal measure. Philosophers also had their say in how passion lived beyond the body. Plato, through his dialogues, argued that love leads the soul toward the eternal. He painted desire as a ladder, starting from the physical, climbing through admiration of beauty, and finally reaching an appreciation of the divine. But you can almost hear the unspoken truth underneath. This ladder was built on the shaky foundation of real people, real gazes, real encounters that made the heart stutter. Even Plato, for all his lofty metaphors, admitted that you don't arrive at divine beauty by staring at a marble column. You arrive there by first being hopelessly, foolishly, passionately captivated by another human being. And yet, the Greeks were never naive about love's consequences. For every hymn that exalted desire, there was a myth warning of its dangers. Think of Phaedra, whose forbidden passion destroyed her family, or Narcissus, who drowned in his own reflection. These tales reminded audiences that eros could immortalize, but also consume. It was as if they were saying, yes, write your poems, sing your songs, worship your lovers, but don't be surprised when it all ends in tears. And somehow, even in tragedy, they found beauty. Because in their worldview, the worst fate was not heartbreak, but indifference. What lingers is the sense that the Greeks were unafraid to admit that passion leaves fingerprints on history. They were realists who wrapped themselves in poetry, comedians who laughed at their own longing, philosophers who turned desire into metaphysics. And perhaps that's why their stories still feel alive. They refused to separate eros from memory, insisting instead that every embrace, every gaze, every whispered promise, no matter how fleeting, deserved to be remembered. And in remembering, desire becomes something larger than the body. It becomes a mirror reflecting both our fragility and our need to be eternal, even if only in someone else's words. Desire in ancient Greece wasn't just something whispered in private or acted upon in the shadows. It was given form, costume, and stage. The theater became a place where passion, lust, and the chaos of human attraction were not only explored, but celebrated and mocked in equal measure. If you were sitting in an amphitheater carved into a hillside, surrounded by thousands of other spectators, the words echoing across the marble stone weren't only entertainment, they were reflections of your own urges, your own shame, your own secret fantasies, magnified into art. And the Greeks, masters of duality, used theater to poke fun at eros, while also warning of its power. You might say they were the first to mix reality TV with moral philosophy, except their cameras were choruses, and their scripts could outlast centuries. Consider the comedies of Aristophanes, where desire was painted as ridiculous, excessive, and impossible to control. In his play Lysistrata, women collectively refuse sex with their husbands until peace is declared. The humor was obvious. Men stumbling around frustrated, women negotiating from their position of power, but beneath the laughter, there was a recognition. Sex governs politics, intimacy shapes nations. The message was both cheeky and profound. It's hard not to laugh imagining an Athenian audience rolling on the floor, while also realizing that the play suggested revolutions could begin in the bedroom. It's the kind of duality modern comedy still struggles to achieve, making you laugh until your sides hurt while forcing you to think about why you're laughing in the first place. But tragedy, too, was soaked in desire. Characters like Phaedra, Medea, or Clytemnestra brought to life the darker edges of eros. Here, passion was no joke. It was destructive, consuming, a fire that refused to be contained. Watching Medea kill her own children after betrayal wasn't just shock theater. It was a grim acknowledgement of how love twisted into vengeance can unmake everything sacred. The audience might have gasped in horror, but they also understood. Haven't we all seen love transform into something unrecognizable, something feral? Of course, most of us stop short of Greek tragedy levels of mayhem, but the point remains. Theater exposed what polite society wanted to hide, showing that eros was not always a gentle muse, but often a ruthless tyrant. The chorus, always present, acted as a mirror for the crowd. They were commentators, sometimes sympathetic, sometimes mocking, always reminding you that you weren't alone in your thoughts. When desire overwhelmed the hero on stage, the chorus voiced what you might have been thinking. Half judgment, half empathy. It's almost comforting, really, to imagine thousands of people together in the open air, nodding along as a chorus shouted out the absurdities of human lust. Imagine if, during one of your worst heartbreaks, a choir appeared in your living room to chant, "We told you this would happen." You'd probably cry and laugh at the same time, and that's exactly the blend the Greeks aimed for. Even the staging itself carried erotic undertones. Masks with exaggerated features, wide eyes, open mouths, were designed not only for visibility, but to exaggerate the emotions of passion and despair. Costumes revealed and concealed strategically. allowing performers to embody both men and women, gods and mortals, lovers and betrayers. To the Greeks, performance was seduction. It was not just telling the story, it was luring the audience into it. You could say the theater was an orgy of gazes, spectators consuming the actors consuming the story, and the story consuming everyone. And humor was everywhere, even when things got serious. The Greeks knew better than anyone that desire is inherently funny, clumsy, desperate, unpredictable. Aristophanes didn't shy away from showing men with permanent erections as a political statement, reminding audiences that power and lust often go hand in hand. Can you imagine modern leaders subjected to the same treatment on stage? The laughter of the crowd wasn't just at the characters, it was at themselves, their neighbors, their leaders. Theater gave them permission to admit that Eros ruled more of their lives than they cared to admit in polite conversation. What makes all of this so enduring is the way it merged entertainment with ritual. Plays were performed during festivals dedicated to Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and yes, unrestrained desire. Attending a play wasn't simply leisure, it was participation in a sacred act. You were not just watching Eros on stage, you were offering your laughter, your tears, your recognition to the god who presided over excess. And maybe that's why these stories survive. Because they weren't written as mere dramas, they were part of a larger dance between humans and the divine. The Greeks made desire impossible to ignore. They turned it into spectacle, philosophy, satire, and prayer all at once. Theater became the stage not just for actors, but for the human condition itself, where Eros strutted and stumbled and burned in front of everyone. And in that grand amphitheater of passion, each audience member carried home not just memories of a performance, but a sharper awareness of their own vulnerabilities. Because while you could laugh at Aristophanes or weep with Euripides, you left knowing one thing. Desire wasn't something on the stage, it was something sitting next to you, inside you, refusing to leave, demanding to be remembered long after the chorus had gone silent. In the ancient Greek imagination, desire was never simply an individual affair. It was cosmic. The gods themselves were believed to be tangled in the same web of passions and jealousies that ensnared mortals. And nowhere was this more evident than in the myths that linked Eros with fate. To listen to these stories was to learn that love could topple kingdoms, ignite wars, and even defy the will of the heavens. The Greeks understood that to desire was to gamble not only with your heart, but with the stability of the world around you. It sounds dramatic, but then again, have you ever seen how one bad breakup can destabilize an entire friend group? The ancients just gave that chaos divine consequences. Take the tale of Helen of Troy, the face that launched 1,000 ships. At its heart, it was a story of Eros so powerful it pulled empires into ruin. Paris's desire for Helen, fueled by a divine contest of vanity between Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, became the spark that lit the Trojan War. The Greeks told and retold this myth not as simple gossip, but as a cautionary tale. Beauty and passion can lead men to madness and cities to fire. In a way, it's the ancient equivalent of a cautionary headline. Local prince destroys civilization over crush, except they sang it with harps and performed it for festivals. The gods, for their part, were no better behaved. Zeus, forever restless in his pursuits, embodied the paradox of power and vulnerability that desire brings. Here was the ruler of the cosmos, able to hurl thunderbolts and shape the world, and yet undone time and again by his own lust. His disguises, swan, bull, shower of gold, weren't just narrative curiosities. They were metaphors for the shape-shifting nature of desire itself. You can't quite pin it down, it slips into forms you don't expect, and before you know it, you've been swept into a story much larger than yourself. The audience would laugh at Zeus's antics, but beneath the laughter, they recognized the universal truth. No matter how powerful you are, Eros humbles you. Then there were tales of mortals caught in divine entanglements, where passion blurred into punishment. Think of Hippolytus, who rejected Aphrodite in favor of chastity, only to be destroyed by her wrath through the tangled love of his stepmother Phaedra. The message was as sharp as a Greek tragedy could deliver. Ignore desire and it consumes you. Indulge desire and it consumes you. There was no safe path, only the dance of balance between restraint and surrender. It's a bit like dieting. You tell yourself one cookie won't hurt, then suddenly you've eaten the whole plate. Except in Greek mythology, the plate usually came with a curse and a tragic ending. Eros himself, the god of love, wasn't a gentle cherub in these stories. In earlier traditions, he was a primordial force, a cosmic principle that emerged at the dawn of creation, binding the universe together. Desire was not a sweet feeling, but the glue of existence, a dangerous necessity that both created order and threatened it. Later, he was softened into the mischievous archer we're more familiar with, but the older Greeks knew better. Desire wasn't cute, it was terrifying. It made you do things against reason, against law, against the gods themselves. And maybe that's why they personified it. It's easier to laugh at a trickster with arrows than to admit your entire reality depends on a force that makes you irrational. Even the underworld wasn't free from Eros. Myths like that of Orpheus and Eurydice revealed how love could transcend death itself, yet still falter in the face of human weakness. Orpheus's backward glance wasn't just a mistake, it was a reminder of how fragile desire is when confronted with doubt. The stories must have struck audiences in the gut, especially those who had lost someone. You can almost hear the silence in the amphitheater when Orpheus turned, a silence not unlike the pauses in our own lives when we recognize we've undone something precious by a single impulsive act. All of these myths layered Eros with both awe and unease. It wasn't merely romance or passion, but a power woven into the very threads of destiny. You could resist it, but resistance usually invited punishment. You could indulge it, but indulgence often carried destruction. What you couldn't do was ignore it. In every festival, in every retelling, the Greeks reminded themselves that Eros was as much a law of the universe as gravity. The gods stumbled because of it, cities fell because of it, and every mortal in the audience knew they too might one day be undone by it. The brilliance of the Greeks was that they didn't sanitize these stories. They left them raw, filled with lust, jealousy, betrayal, and longing, because they knew those were the truths that bound humanity together. And perhaps that's why we still tell them, not to marvel at ancient strangeness, but to recognize our own reflection in those tales. Strip away the togas, the amphorae of wine, the temples under the Mediterranean sun, and the core remains startlingly familiar. Desire is still the unruly guest at the table of our lives, knocking over cups, starting fires, and daring us to pretend we can control it. In ancient Greece, sexuality was not hidden in shadows, but lived out in rituals, festivals, and myths that spoke of its sacred and dangerous power. It was a culture where Eros was treated as a divine force, shaping not only private lives, but the fate of cities and the will of the gods themselves. And yet, behind the beauty of marble temples and the poetry of Homer, there were stories of passion so tangled and raw that they still feel uncomfortably close to us today. If you strip away the centuries, the scrolls, and the statues, what you find is that their struggles with desire sound like echoes of our own. Jealousy, obsession, temptation, and the foolish things people will risk for a taste of intimacy. One of the striking things about the Greeks was how unashamed they were in linking sex with the divine. Festivals like the Dionysian Mysteries didn't just celebrate wine and theater. They celebrated unrestrained indulgence, dissolving the walls between ecstasy and madness. Imagine an entire city plunging into a carnival where rules were suspended, roles reversed, and inhibitions discarded. To the participants, it wasn't chaos, but communion, a way to dissolve into something greater than themselves. In a way, they were practicing what many of us secretly crave but rarely admit, the freedom to break the routines and masks we wear every day, to surrender to impulses without fear of judgment. Of course, if you tried to explain that to your boss on Monday morning, I wasn't late, I was dissolving into Dionysian ecstasy, you'd probably get written up, proving how much more forgiving the gods were than corporate HR. But not all expressions of Eros were celebrated with laughter and wine. Some carried the weight of fear and taboo. Consider the cults of Aphrodite and the practice of sacred prostitution in certain temples, where intimacy was seen not as a sin, but as a pathway to divine favor. For the Greeks, the act itself could be transformed into a ritual of fertility and blessing, a transaction not merely of flesh, but of fate. Outsiders might call it scandalous, yet for the participants it was service, no different than sacrificing a goat or pouring libations of oil. What does that say about how flexible morality becomes when framed as devotion? It almost makes you wonder how many modern vices could be repackaged as virtues if only given the right temple and a convincing priest. Stories also reveal the shadow side of desire, the moments when it crossed from holy to destructive. The myth of Pasiphae, cursed to desire a bull and birthing the Minotaur, shows how Eros twisted into monstrosity could give birth to terror. It sounds grotesque, but the underlying truth is that unchecked obsession breeds consequences that spiral far beyond the individual. The labyrinth of the Minotaur is just a metaphorical version of the psychological labyrinths we trap ourselves in when desire mutates into compulsion. The Greeks didn't need Freud to tell them this. They already knew that unbridled lust could create monsters both real and metaphorical. And, if we're honest, anyone who's ever stalked an ex's social media at 3 a.m. knows the Minotaur still lives, except now it's armed with Wi-Fi. Yet for every tale of destruction, there were also myths of transcendence. Orpheus's journey to reclaim Eurydice from the underworld is one of the most haunting love stories of all time, not because it ends in triumph, but because it ends in failure. His backward glance, that single moment of doubt, undoes everything. The Greeks taught through tragedy what we learn through heartbreak, that even love strong enough to defy death can falter on a flicker of insecurity. It's a brutal reminder that desire doesn't just demand passion, it demands trust. And sometimes the hardest part of love isn't the chase or the sacrifice, but the discipline to keep moving forward without looking back. If that isn't relevant in an age where one text message can resurrect an entire dead relationship, I don't know what is. The gods themselves were mirrors of human frailty. Zeus, forever entangled in his disguises and dalliances, was both a symbol of unstoppable power and a walking cautionary tale. Hera, his wife, embodied both dignity and fury, punishing not only Zeus's lovers but their children. In this divine soap opera, mortals saw their own marriages reflected back at them, just with more thunderbolts and fewer therapists. It's almost comforting, in a twisted way, to realize that even in the heavens, relationships were messy, jealousy was rampant, and fidelity was negotiable. Perhaps that's why the myths were so enduring. They didn't present gods as distant paragons, but as exaggerated versions of ourselves, stumbling through the same pitfalls of passion. What makes all of this so captivating is not just the content of the stories, but the cultural honesty they carried. The Greeks didn't sanitize Eros. They didn't hide it behind euphemisms or relegate it to whispered corners. They brought it to the stage, the temple, the festival, and even the battlefield, recognizing that desire could build alliances as easily as it could tear them apart. And isn't that the truth still? Nations rise and fall on who marries whom. Scandals destroy careers, and entire industries thrive on the promise of fulfilling longing. Strip away the marble in myth, and you see the same human heart beating with the same unruly rhythm. The genius of the Greeks was their refusal to pretend that Eros was safe. They painted it in all its colors, sacred, scandalous, ecstatic, and catastrophic, because they knew life itself was bound to it. Desire was not a side note in their story, it was the ink with which the story was written. And the more we listen to those old myths, the more we realize that the forces they described haven't gone anywhere. They just changed costumes, traded laurel crowns for smartphones and temples for nightclubs. But the essence remains. Eros is the unpredictable guest who reshapes every room it enters, reminding us that no matter how advanced we become, we are still creatures undone and remade by the oldest power of all. In the ancient Greek imagination, Eros was not only about personal desire or divine drama, it was woven into the fabric of politics, war, and social order. Desire could crown kings, topple empires, or redirect the course of history. It wasn't simply a matter of who loved whom, but of how those attachments and obsessions spilled over into the world at large. The Greeks knew that passion was never private for long. In their eyes, it was like fire, light and warmth for a home if controlled, but a raging inferno if allowed to spread unchecked. Think of Alcibiades, one of Athens' most dazzling yet destructive figures. Charismatic, brilliant, and notoriously seductive, he had the sort of magnetism that made people abandon reason. His lovers and allies adored him, his enemies despised him, and his city never quite knew whether he was its savior or its doom. His defection to Sparta during the Peloponnesian War was fueled as much by personal entanglements as political strategy, a reminder that even geopolitics can hinge on desire. Imagine entire campaigns turning on something that today we might dismiss as a messy love life, except in this case, it was a love life with the power to change the balance of the Greek world. It makes you wonder how many wars in history were less about resources and more about bruised egos and tangled bedsheets. The intertwining of Eros with politics didn't stop there. In Thebes, the sacred band was a military unit composed entirely of pairs of lovers, bound not only by loyalty but by intimacy. The idea was simple. Men who loved one another would fight more fiercely, unwilling to show cowardice in front of their partners. And by all accounts it worked. They became one of the most formidable forces in Greece until their defeat by Philip of Macedon. It's one of those strange historical truths that sounds like a philosopher's experiment, yet it shows how the Greeks dared to institutionalize passion as a weapon. They recognized something modern armies might never admit. Sometimes love makes you braver than duty. Even in the domestic sphere, Eros shaped alliances and rivalries. Marriages were rarely about romance. They were contracts between families, forged for wealth, power, and prestige. Yet beneath the surface of these calculated unions, desire simmered, sometimes openly, sometimes dangerously. The plays of Euripides capture this tension with unsettling clarity. Wives who burn with passions unacknowledged, husbands who stray into disasters, households torn apart not by external enemies but by the desires of their own inhabitants. Greek tragedy was a mirror held up to society, reminding its audience that you didn't need foreign armies to bring ruin. Eros could destroy from within. If you've ever seen a family gathering implode over who's sitting next to whom at dinner, you already understand this principle. The power of Eros was also visible in how Greeks approached mentorship and education. Relationships between older men and younger protégés, though controversial to us, were framed as bonds where affection and instruction were intertwined. The Greeks insisted these ties could cultivate virtue, courage, and loyalty, yet they also knew the thin line between mentorship and exploitation. Philosophers like Plato wrestled with this paradox, praising love as the highest ladder toward truth in the Symposium, while also warning that physical indulgence could cloud the soul. It was as though they were saying, yes, passion can elevate you, but only if you can stop yourself from eating the whole cake. And, predictably, most couldn't resist. The blending of Eros with the sacred, the political, and the personal created a society that lived with constant tension. To them, passion was not something to be hidden, but something to be negotiated, balanced, and sometimes indulged. Their myths, plays, and histories all circled the same lesson. Desire is never neutral. It creates ripples that extend far beyond the individuals involved. Perhaps this is why the Greeks treated Eros with reverence and suspicion at the same time, because they knew it could raise heroes or ruin kingdoms, inspire bravery, or sow betrayal. And the more we look at their stories, the harder it is to dismiss them as relics of the past. Our own world is no less ruled by Eros, even if we prefer to cloak it in rational explanations. Scandals still collapse governments, obsessions still spark wars of words and weapons, and love still makes fools of the wise. The Greeks would probably laugh at our attempts to separate personal passion from public life, because to them it was obvious. Eros always seeps through the cracks. The only real question is whether it will warm us or burn everything to the ground. The Greeks did not only imagine Eros in the realm of gods, heroes, or politics. They wove it into daily rituals, turning even the simplest gatherings into miniature theaters of desire. The symposium, for instance, was never just about drinking wine. It was a stage where poetry, music, and flirtation unfolded in equal measure. Men reclined on couches, wine diluted with water flowing freely, while courtesans and performers added an intoxicating layer of beauty and provocation. If you squint a little, it was less like a solemn gathering of philosophers and more like a high-end lounge where philosophy and seduction mingled in the same breath. Inside those walls, Eros became a currency. A witty remark could be as alluring as a physical gesture, and a well-timed poem could stir hearts as effectively as a kiss. The Greeks understood something we often forget, that desire is not only about the body, but also about the mind. In fact, for many, the art of conversation was foreplay. Plato's Symposium makes this explicit. Love was discussed as a ladder, climbing from physical attraction to intellectual passion, each rung pulling you higher toward truth. It's as if they believed flirting could be a pathway to philosophy, which makes you wonder what Plato might say about today's dating apps. Probably something like, you've skipped the ladder entirely and are just shouting from the bottom rung. At the same time, Symposia blurred the lines between sacred and profane. The god Dionysus presided over these occasions, his spirit filling the wine cups and loosening inhibitions. Desire flowed as freely as the drink, and participants often found themselves swept into moments where boundaries collapsed, between guest and host, between wisdom and folly, between restraint and indulgence. It was dangerous, yes, but that danger was part of the allure. To be drunk with wine and desire was, in a sense, to brush against the divine. It was an experiment in living at the edge of chaos, and the Greeks relished it. Beyond Symposia, Eros also seeped into seasonal rituals. Festivals honoring gods like Dionysus or Aphrodite often included masked dances, processions, and secret rites where sexuality was not hidden but exalted. Participants wore disguises, not simply for anonymity, but to blur the boundaries of identity. Masks allowed them to step outside themselves, to play at being another, to surrender to desires they might suppress in ordinary life. It was theater, but theater with real consequences. Anthropologists suggest that these collective outpourings of Eros helped release tensions in society, a kind of safety valve that kept the city from exploding. In other words, a sanctioned chaos that paradoxically maintained order. Even within domestic life, Eros found subtle forms. Couples offered prayers to gods for fertility, weaving desire into the rhythms of agriculture and family. Love potions were brewed from herbs, amulets worn to attract affection, spells whispered to bind lovers or ward off rivals. These practices may sound quaint, but they remind us that Eros was not abstract. It was urgent and practical. A harvest depended on fertility, lineage on passion, survival on bonds of intimacy. What we might dismiss as superstition, they embraced as the fabric of existence. And if you think love charms are obsolete, consider how many people today still swear by lucky rituals before a date. The Greeks would probably chuckle knowingly. What emerges from these glimpses is a society that did not compartmentalize desire. It was present in the symposium, in festivals, in marriages, in prayers, and myths. It was everywhere, because they recognized it as everywhere. Modern culture often tries to sanitize Eros, tucking it into neat categories. Romance here, politics there, religion far away. But the Greeks refused to split it apart. To them, Eros was a thread binding every domain of life, weaving human vulnerability and divine power into the same tapestry. And perhaps that's why their stories still resonate. They remind us that desire is not something we control with perfect rationality. It sneaks into our conversations, our institutions, our rituals, even our philosophies. The Greeks knew it, laughed about it, sang about it, feared it, and celebrated it all at once. Which makes you wonder if we, for all our sophistication, are any different, or if Eros is still pulling the strings while we pretend to be the puppeteers. Desire in ancient Greece was not always thunderous or wrapped in myth. Sometimes it showed itself in the smallest gestures of everyday life, in the way people decorated their homes and how they shared meals, or in the songs sung at weddings. To step into a Greek household was to step into a space where Eros lingered not only in the bedroom, but in the kitchen, the garden, even the courtyard where neighbors could overhear conversations. They believed desire was not meant to be hidden. It was part of the fabric of life, as ordinary and essential as bread or olive oil. Yet, of course, nothing about it ever remained simple. Take the wedding rituals, for instance. Marriage was not a celebration of love in our modern sense, but a public acknowledgement of duty and lineage. Still, desire was carefully staged into the ceremony. Brides were adorned with perfumes, veils, and garlands of flowers, each symbolic of fertility and allure. The act of unveiling the bride was not only practical, but theatrical, almost like revealing a sacred statue. Imagine the tension in the room, the nervous excitement, everyone watching for that moment when private intimacy suddenly became public destiny. It was as if Eros itself had been invited to stand at the altar, veiled and waiting to be unwrapped. But beneath this solemn structure, personal passions found ways to slip through. Poetry became a vessel for those feelings, offering coded messages when direct speech was impossible. Sappho of Lesbos is the most famous example, her verses painting vivid images of longing that could still sting across millennia. Her words captured the paradox of desire, sweet yet painful, uniting yet isolating. Reading her lines, one senses a world where Eros could overwhelm even the most disciplined heart. It's funny, really. People today write cryptic Instagram captions about their crushes, while Sappho composed lyrics so powerful that they still make readers blush. Maybe not much has changed after all. And then there was the art. Vases, murals, and statues often displayed scenes of intimacy and seduction, not as something shameful, but as part of daily reality. Some were playful, others explicit, but all of them confirmed that Eros was never far from hand or eye. Imagine drinking wine from a cup that casually depicted a mythological tryst. It's a reminder that desire wasn't only in the stories told, it was literally in the hands of those who lived. Art was a mirror, but also a provocation. And isn't that what desire does? It makes you see yourself reflected in someone else's gaze, even when you don't expect it. Beyond the private sphere, communal rituals also infused daily life with erotic undertones. Farmers prayed to fertility deities for bountiful harvests, linking the cycles of desire with the cycles of the earth. Festivals included songs laced with innuendo, jokes that made even the most serious citizen laugh, because humor was a release valve for tension. They knew that laughter and Eros were close cousins, both capable of disarming, both of exposing vulnerability. There's something universally human in this, the way people giggle at suggestive jokes, even when they're centuries apart in time. It shows us how Eros was not only about passion, but about play, about keeping the heart light even in the midst of seriousness. And yet, for all the playfulness, there was also danger. The Greeks were keenly aware that desire could destabilize lives if unchecked. That's why so many myths warned of obsession, jealousy, or betrayal. But rather than shoving these truths under the rug, they turned them into theater, poetry, and art. They wanted people to look desire in the eye, to laugh at it, fear it, embrace it, and most of all, recognize it. They knew you couldn't silence Eros. You could only negotiate with it. Maybe that's why their stories still captivate us. They remind us of the fragility in every human bond and the raw fire at its core. So when we picture ancient Greece, we shouldn't imagine marble temples and solemn philosophers alone. We should imagine homes filled with whispered songs, feasts charged with flirtation, neighbors exchanging glances across courtyards, and weddings where Eros was dressed in flowers and perfumes. They lived knowing desire would not stay neatly confined. It seeped through walls, spilled into art, broke into laughter, and sometimes set entire lives aflame. And just like then, today it remains the force that makes us stumble, laugh at ourselves, and keep moving forward, always curious about what lies just around the corner of passion. In ancient Greece, secrecy was never truly silent. Even in the most guarded rituals, desire hummed like a low drum beat beneath the surface. It is almost comical to think that the same people who built philosophies of reason and moderation also indulged in ceremonies that celebrated abandon, wildness, and intimacy that defied the ordinary boundaries of life. Perhaps they understood something we often forget, that people are not made of neat compartments of logic and order. They are messy, unpredictable, and drawn to things that make them feel alive, even if just for a fleeting moment. One of the strangest contradictions of Greek society was how open and hidden Eros could be at the same time. In one moment, sacred spaces echoed with prayers and sacrifices to the gods. In the next, those same spaces were used for rituals that blurred the lines between spirituality and sensuality. Temples were not just cold marble structures. They were stages where the human and divine collided, sometimes with incense and hymns, sometimes with laughter, dancing, and bodies weaving together in celebration. Imagine being a traveler walking into a city during a festival and realizing that the path to enlightenment passed directly through music, wine, and a sense of vulnerability that left little hidden. desire for the Greeks was rarely treated as a shameful impulse. Instead, it was woven into the cycle of life. Farmers saw it reflected in the fertility of their fields, sailors in the whims of the sea, and newlyweds in the hope of future children. To them, Eros was a reminder that life is not static. It grows, changes, and demands risk. And like every risk, it was both thrilling and dangerous. Too much indulgence could ruin a man, while too much restraint could rob life of its color. That balancing act is not so different from ours today. Swap Dionysian festivals for modern bachelor parties, and you'll see echoes of the same struggle. How far can celebration go before it becomes chaos? Yet the Greeks managed to package even chaos into beauty. Their plays often ridiculed excess, but at the same time, reveled in showing it. Comedy and tragedy alike were filled with stories of passion gone wrong, obsession turned destructive, and flirtations that changed destinies. The audience laughed or wept, but beneath it all, they were reminded of their own desires, the choices they made in secret, and the consequences that might follow. Humor, after all, was a safe way of touching dangerous truths. It's funny to think how people 2,000 years ago were already using theater as a mirror for their own guilty pleasures. It seems Netflix didn't invent binge-watching drama. It only gave it a new stage. Art carried the same duality. On one vase, you might find delicate depictions of lovers exchanging gentle glances. On another, scenes so raw and explicit they could still make a modern museum-goer blush. The point wasn't provocation for its own sake, but a recognition of reality. Desire was everywhere, and art was simply honest enough to record it. By holding those cups, plates, or statues in their hands, Greeks were constantly reminded that Eros was not only for whispered corners, it was part of daily bread. And when you think about it, isn't that exactly how the human heart works? Even when we're paying bills, running errands, or washing dishes, the thought of longing sneaks in, coloring the mundane with secret fire. But desire wasn't just about the union of bodies. It was also about power, trust, and vulnerability. The Greeks knew that intimacy was as much about the mind as the flesh, and that it could bind people together or tear them apart. Some cults taught initiates to surrender not only physically but spiritually, learning that true closeness required letting go of control. It's a lesson most people still resist today. After all, giving someone else the key to your inner self is terrifying. And yet, it's also the only way to truly be seen. That paradox, the push and pull of fear and longing, is what kept Eros from being just an instinct. It became a lifelong riddle, one that poets, priests, and ordinary people kept trying to solve. Everywhere in Greek life, from the household to the theater, from the temple to the symposium, desire pulsed like a second heartbeat. It was not confined to bedrooms or sacred groves. It slipped into jokes, paintings, prayers, and daily rituals. It made people laugh. It made them weep, and it often left them bewildered. But they understood something profound. Eros was never meant to be conquered. It was meant to be acknowledged, danced with, and sometimes even surrendered to. And in that dance, as clumsy as it might have been, they discovered the essence of what it means to be human, restless, yearning, fragile, and endlessly curious about what passion might demand next. The more you peel back the layers of ancient Greek ritual, the clearer it becomes that they were never simply indulging in excess for the sake of shock. Beneath the wild songs, the intoxicated dances, and the sacred unions lay a structure, a belief that the human body and its passions were pathways to the divine. For them, the spiritual and the sensual were not opposing forces at war with each other. They were different doors opening into the same room, and that room, filled with incense smoke, flickering torchlight, and the sound of drums echoing off stone walls, was where mortals tried to meet gods halfway. Imagine stepping into such a place, half-holy sanctuary, half-secret theater of desires, where every whisper carried both a prayer and a temptation. There was a paradox here that made the Greeks both fascinating and unsettling. On one hand, they celebrated Eros as a natural, vital force that connected human beings to the eternal cycles of life and creation. On the other, they wrapped it in mystery, often hiding its rawest expressions behind locked chambers, masked processions, or coded poetry that only initiates could truly decipher. It is almost funny, in a tragic way, how societies throughout history have repeated this same dance, praising passion as divine while simultaneously shoving it behind curtains, out of sight. You see the same pattern today in advertising campaigns that glorify desire on billboards, while entire communities still squirm to talk about it at the dinner table. Greek rituals thrived on that tension, transforming what might have been a simple indulgence into something charged with meaning. Every offering of wine poured onto the earth was both a toast and a sacrifice. Every garland of flowers placed on a lover's shoulders was a reminder that beauty fades quickly. Even the laughter that filled their gatherings often masked a deeper truth. That pleasure was fleeting, but it left behind echoes that shaped memory and identity. The same people who toasted Dionysus with overflowing cups also wrote tragedies about how easily joy turns to ruin when it crosses the thin line into obsession. It was their way of admitting, perhaps with a smile, that no one ever truly gets out of life without being burned a little by desire. When we look at these rituals from the outside, it is tempting to treat them as curiosities, relics of a people far removed from us. But the uncomfortable reality is how familiar they feel. Strip away the togas, the laurel crowns, the marble temples, and what you see are human beings trying to make sense of the very same impulses we wrestle with today. They too asked why people fall in love with the wrong person, why passion can consume logic, why joy often carries a shadow of guilt, and why longing can be both a blessing and a curse. The difference is that they stage those questions in public, transforming them into acts of communal reflection. If modern life hides these questions behind glowing screens and silent scrolling, the Greeks shouted them in choruses under the open sky. The most haunting thing about these ancient practices is how they leave us staring at our own contradictions. We laugh at their excess, but are we not guilty of our own rituals of overindulgence, whether in endless scrolling, streaming marathons, or the silent worship of consumer goods that promise happiness? Their feasts ended in dizziness and collapse, hours in empty credit card balances and sleep deprivation. The costumes have changed, but the human hunger behind them remains the same. And maybe that is the lasting lesson of those rituals, that desire in all its messy forms cannot be erased or neatly packaged. It demands recognition, it demands honesty, and when ignored, it only grows louder, beating against the walls of our ordinary lives like the echo of distant drums. The Greeks, for all their flaws and contradictions, understood something profound, that to live fully meant to dance with Eros, even when it led them into dangerous or absurd places. They saw in passion a mirror of the gods themselves, unpredictable, merciful one moment and destructive the next. And though we may shake our heads at their orgiastic festivals or their temple practices, there is a strange wisdom in their refusal to divide life into neat, sanitized compartments. They embraced the full spectrum of being human, laughter and shame, beauty and ruin, ecstasy and regret. Perhaps that is why their stories still resonate, why their art still unsettles us, and why their rituals, no matter how scandalous, refuse to fade quietly into history. Because in the end, the secrets of ancient Greece were never really about secrecy at all. They were about exposing the raw, unfiltered truths of human longing, even if it meant hiding them in plain sight. And in that paradox, between concealment and celebration, holiness and humor, we find the same questions we carry today, lingering unanswered, waiting for the courage to be spoken out loud.